There was a time when the greatest threat to humanity was not war, disease, or another civilization. It was the sky. The rain could stop for generations. Lakes could vanish. Forests could retreat until familiar landscapes became open grassland and dust. Ice could spread across continents. Volcanoes could darken the atmosphere. Sea levels could rise high enough to erase entire homelands from the map. And sometimes the climate could change so quickly that a person born into one kind of world might die in another. Yet somehow, through all of it, human beings survived. Not because we were the strongest animals on Earth. We were not. Not because we were the fastest. We were not. And certainly not because we were naturally equipped for every environment we entered. Our bodies had evolved beneath the African sun. We had no thick fur, no claws, no armored hide, and no extraordinary resistance to cold. Still, our ancestors eventually lived in deserts, tropical forests, frozen steppes, mountain valleys, coastal marshes, and landscapes so cold that winter could kill an unprotected person within hours. The question at the center of this story is simple. How? How did small communities of Homo sapiens survive when the environments around them repeatedly collapsed? How did they endure droughts that lasted longer than a human lifetime? How did people born in Africa learn to live beside glaciers? What happened when volcanic ash entered the atmosphere and sunlight weakened? What did families do when the sea slowly swallowed the valleys where their ancestors had hunted for generations? And what happened when, after thousands of years of warming, winter suddenly returned? Tonight, we will travel backward through a world before cities, before farms, before writing, and before history had a name. We will stand beside shrinking African lakes. We will follow hunters into the cold grasslands of Eurasia. We will sit beside fires while storms move through the darkness outside. We will watch coastlines disappear. We will cross broad plains that no longer exist because they now lie beneath the sea. And through every chapter, one idea will return again and again. Human survival depended less on conquering nature than on adapting to it. Our ancestors survived because they could move, because they could cooperate, because they could eat many different foods, because they made tools, because they controlled fire, because they learned from older generations, because distant communities exchanged materials, information, and sometimes refuge. And perhaps most importantly, because humans could imagine a way of living that had never existed before. When the world changed, they changed with it. Our story begins long before anyone crossed the frozen landscapes of the Ice Age. It begins in Africa, beside a lake whose waters are slowly disappearing, and with a small group of people facing one of the oldest decisions in human history. Stay with the world you know, or walk into the unknown. Imagine waking before sunrise in Eastern Africa more than 150,000 years ago. There is no village around you, no walls, no fields, no road disappearing toward a distant settlement. There are only perhaps 20 or 30 people sleeping close together beneath a shallow shelter, beside the remains of a fire that has burned low during the night. The air before dawn is surprisingly cool. Someone rises and places a few dry branches onto the coals. For a moment, almost nothing happens. Then a faint orange glow appears. Smoke twists upward. A child moves closer to the warmth. Far beyond the camp, invisible in the darkness, a lake stretches across the lowlands. or at least it used to. The oldest people remember when its waters came much closer. They remember reeds growing where there is now cracked earth. They remember seeing large animals along the muddy shore. They remember years when the grass stayed green longer. But the children growing up now know another landscape. They know dust. They know long walks to water. They know that certain streams stop flowing before the dry season is finished. They know that the animals do not always return to the same places. And without knowing it, they are living inside one of the forces that will shape the future of our species. Climate instability. Africa, the continent where Homo sapiens evolved, was never a single unchanging paradise. It contained deserts, grasslands, forests, mountains, river valleys, wetlands, and long coastlines. And over immense periods of time, these environments shifted. Rainfall increased and decreased. Lakes expanded and contracted. Vegetation moved. Deserts grew and retreated. Places that were rich in water during one period could become dry in another. A landscape that supported abundant animals for generations could slowly become something very different. These changes were influenced by many forces. Earth's orbit around the sun changes gradually over long spans of time. The tilt and orientation of the planet also vary. These astronomical cycles alter the distribution of sunlight reaching different parts of Earth, which in turn can influence monsoons and rainfall patterns. Ocean circulation changes. Atmospheric systems shift. Ice sheets far away can affect global climate. The result, especially over tens and hundreds of thousands of years, is not a stable background. It is movement, expansion, contraction, wet periods, dry periods. And for early humans, climate was not an abstract pattern on a scientific graph. It was the location of the next drink of water. It was whether fruit appeared on a familiar tree. It was whether antelope passed through the valley. It was whether a child could survive the journey to the next spring. For much of human prehistory, survival may have depended on noticing changes before they became disasters. Consider the shrinking lake. At first, the difference might be easy to ignore. The shoreline moves a little farther away. Perhaps there is less rain that year. Perhaps animals gather in slightly different places. No one has any reason to believe the change will last. Then another season passes, and another. The mud at the edge of the water becomes hard. Some plants disappear. Fish become harder to catch. Herds travel farther. The group must walk longer each day. Children become tired. Older people struggle. Then someone remembers another place. Maybe a valley beyond the hills. Maybe a spring visited years ago. Maybe a river known through another group of people. This memory matters, because one of the most important survival tools in prehistory could not be carried in the hand. It existed inside the mind. Knowledge of the landscape, where water remained during drought, where certain roots could be dug from the ground, which fruits appeared after rain, which plants were poisonous, where stones suitable for tools could be found, where predators were common, where neighboring groups camped, where a person might go when the familiar world failed. To us, moving may sound simple. If a region becomes dangerous, leave. But migration in the prehistoric world was never a casual decision. There were no maps, no weather forecasts, no written descriptions of distant valleys, no guarantee that another water source existed beyond the horizon. Travel itself was dangerous. A group carried infants. Some members might be injured. Older adults moved more slowly. Food had to be found along the way. Predators lived in the same landscapes. An unfamiliar territory might already be used by another human community. Leaving could mean survival. Leaving could also mean death. So imagine the conversation beside that drying lake. Not a formal meeting. Not a council with written rules. Just human beings sitting near a fire. Perhaps one person wants to remain. There is still water. There are still animals. This is the place where they know the paths. This is where children were born. This is where relatives died. The unknown is dangerous. Another person has recently traveled farther south and seen clouds gathering over distant hills. Someone else remembers a river valley visited in childhood. An older woman may recall a drought decades earlier when her parents moved the group for several seasons before eventually returning. Her memory is not merely a story. It is survival information. Perhaps the most important information anyone possesses. And this is where human adaptation begins to reveal its extraordinary character. Many animals migrate. Many animals change their diets. Many species cooperate. Humans are not unique simply because we perform these behaviors. What became increasingly powerful was the way human beings combined them. Movement could be guided by remembered experience. Experience could be communicated through language. Knowledge could be shared with children who had never personally seen the event being described. Tools could extend what the body was capable of doing. Social relationships could provide access to territories beyond one's immediate home. A drought did not only test the body, it tested the network. Suppose one group knew only a single hunting strategy. Perhaps they depended heavily on a particular large animal. As long as that animal remained common, life could be relatively predictable. Hunters knew its behavior. They knew its trails. They knew the best places for an ambush. But then rainfall patterns changed. Vegetation shifted. The animals moved elsewhere. Suddenly, expertise that had supported generations was no longer enough. The best hunter in the region could become helpless if there was nothing left to hunt. A more flexible community had another advantage. Perhaps they could dig underground storage organs from plants. Perhaps they collected seeds. Perhaps they hunted small animals when large game became scarce. Perhaps they trapped birds. Perhaps they gathered shellfish along a coast. Perhaps they knew where freshwater fish could be found. Perhaps they cracked nuts or processed difficult plant foods. None of these resources alone had to be perfect. That was the point. The strength came from variety. If one food disappeared, another might remain. If large mammals left, smaller animals might survive. If inland plants failed, coastal resources might provide an alternative. If a familiar river dried up, knowledge of underground water or distant springs could become essential. Humans were slowly becoming experts, not in one environment, but in changing environments. This flexibility can be difficult to see archaeologically. Stone tools survive for enormous periods. Bones sometimes survive. Shells can survive. But many of the most important technologies of survival disappear almost completely. Wood rots. Plant fibers decay. Leather vanishes. Baskets disappear. Digging sticks are rarely preserved. The knowledge needed to use them leaves no fossil. An archaeologist may discover a sharp stone point and immediately recognize technology. But knowing the season when a particular root becomes edible is also technology. Remembering that water sometimes collects beneath a certain kind of dry riverbed is technology. Knowing how to carry an infant safely across difficult ground is technology. Knowing which families in another region will share food during a crisis is technology. A great deal of human survival depended on tools that were invisible, and among the most powerful of those invisible tools was cooperation. Picture a successful hunt. It is easy to imagine one heroic hunter confronting an animal alone. Reality was often more social. People could track together, drive animals together, watch different escape routes, share information, carry meat, protect the carcass from scavengers, prepare food, care for children while others traveled, gather fuel for fires, repair tools, collect plants. Human survival rarely depended on one person doing everything. It depended on individuals performing different tasks inside a cooperative system. This matters even more during environmental stress. When food becomes scarce, a solitary person has very little protection against bad luck. An injured ankle might be fatal. A failed hunt might mean starvation. A sick child might not survive. But in a social group, risk can be shared. One person fails while another succeeds. One person becomes sick while others provide food. A skilled elder who can no longer hunt may still possess knowledge that saves everyone. Cooperation turns many vulnerable individuals into something more resilient than any one of them alone. There is another important detail. The climate changes of Africa did not always produce a simple story in which dryness forced people to leave. Sometimes wetter periods opened new landscapes. Rain could transform regions that had been difficult to cross. Grasslands spread. Lakes appeared. River systems strengthened. The Great Sahara itself has repeatedly shifted between extremely dry conditions and periods when parts of it were much greener. During favorable windows, humans and animals could move through places that later became formidable barriers. This means climate did two apparently opposite things. It trapped people, and it opened doors. A wet period could create new migration routes. A dry period could isolate communities. Later changes could reconnect them. Human populations may have repeatedly separated and met again. Different groups encountered different environments, developed different habits, and then exchanged genes, tools, behaviors, and ideas when conditions brought them back into contact. Instead of imagining early Homo sapiens living as one steadily growing population in one small birthplace, it may be better to imagine a shifting network of communities scattered across Africa. Some lived near coasts, some near lakes, some in grasslands, some in wooded regions. Some became isolated, others met. Populations expanded and contracted as the climate changed. Across this enormous landscape, the features of our species emerged over time. And all the while, the environment kept asking the same question. Can you change? One of the clearest answers came from food. Humans have remarkably flexible diets. We are capable of eating meat, fish, shellfish, fruits, seeds, nuts, leaves, roots, tubers, insects, and many other foods depending on culture and environment. But flexibility is not the same as simply being able to swallow different things. Many foods require knowledge and processing. A hard seed may need to be crushed. A root may need to be cooked. Shellfish must be collected at the right place and time. A poisonous plant may become edible only after careful preparation. Fish require different techniques from hunting antelope. Each new resource represents learned behavior, and learned behavior can spread faster than biological evolution. This distinction changed everything. An animal population confronted with a new climate can adapt biologically over many generations if enough individuals survive and reproduce. Humans can sometimes adapt culturally within a single lifetime. If winters become colder, you do not need to evolve fur if you can make clothing. If prey becomes scarce, you do not need new teeth if you learn to process another food. If water disappears, you do not need to become a desert species if you can remember another route. Culture allowed humans to respond at the speed of learning, and learning could accumulate. A child watching an adult gather food does not begin at zero. A young hunter learning to recognize tracks inherits experience gathered by people before he was born. A girl learning where water remains during drought receives knowledge that may be older than her grandparents. Human beings became creatures surrounded by inherited information. Not written information, not yet, but information carried in stories, habits, gestures, demonstrations, warnings, and repeated routines. One generation could give the next generation a map that existed only in memory. And during climate crises, that map could mean life. Imagine now that the lake has continued to shrink. The decision has finally been made. The group will leave. Possessions are limited. Stone tools can be carried. Useful pieces of raw material are wrapped or held. Children remain close. Food gathered for the first days of travel is divided. Perhaps the oldest people know the first part of the route. Beyond that, knowledge becomes uncertain. At dawn, they begin walking. They do not think of themselves as pioneers. They do not know that distant descendants may eventually cross continents. They are not trying to change human history. They are searching for water. Behind them is a place full of memory, a shoreline where children played, trees that once gave shade, paths worn by years of walking, the remains of old fires, perhaps graves, perhaps places associated with stories no archaeologist will ever recover. Ahead lies uncertainty. The first ridge, then another, a dry valley, a narrow stream, tracks in the mud, birds in the distance. Every sign is interpreted. Clouds, plants, animal droppings, the direction of wind, the color of soil. Survival is an act of attention. Eventually, perhaps after days or weeks, they find another source of water. The group stops. A new camp is made. Fire is lit. Children sleep. Tools are repaired. And for a time, life becomes ordinary again. That ordinary moment contains one of the deepest patterns in our history. A world became difficult. People observed. They remembered. They cooperated. They moved. They learned. They survived. Then the next generation inherited both their bodies and their knowledge. Over thousands of years, such decisions were repeated beyond counting. No single migration created humanity's success. No single invention saved our species. No single genius discovered adaptation. It happened through countless small choices made by ordinary people whose names are lost forever. A mother carrying a child toward a distant spring. A hunter deciding to follow unfamiliar tracks. An elder remembering a valley from decades earlier. Someone trying a new food because the old one has disappeared. Someone showing another person how to shape a tool. Someone offering shelter to visitors from a neighboring group. Tiny decisions, repeated through generations, and slowly, a species capable of extraordinary movement emerged. Eventually, favorable climate windows opened routes beyond Africa. Some human populations expanded through northeastern Africa and into Southwest Asia. Others remained behind. Many migrations likely failed. Some groups disappeared. Some may have moved outward and later retreated. Human expansion was not a single triumphant march across a map. It was a long sequence of movements, pauses, returns, extinctions, encounters, and new attempts. But eventually, Homo sapiens crossed a threshold. Beyond Africa waited environments unlike those in which our species had originated. Longer winters, shorter growing seasons, snow, frozen ground, cold winds sweeping across open landscapes. Animals adapted to conditions no tropical primate should have found comfortable. The human body had not suddenly grown thick fur. We had not developed the hide of a rhinoceros or the dense coat of a mammoth. What traveled north was something stranger. A warm climate animal carrying fire. A vulnerable primate carrying tools. A social creature carrying memory. And perhaps that is the first great lesson in the story of humanity and climate. Migration itself was a technology. Our ancestors survived not because they could force a dying lake to fill again. They survived because they could recognize when the old way of life was no longer enough. They could carry what they knew. They could leave familiar ground. And they could begin again somewhere else. Soon, some of their descendants would move into a world where water did not disappear because of heat. It hardened into ice. And there, beneath long winter skies, humanity would face an entirely different test. How does an animal born beneath the African sun learn to live in the cold? Imagine stepping out of a shelter before dawn and discovering that the ground has become white. Not with flowers, not with ash, with snow. For people whose distant ancestors evolved beneath the African sun, this was a landscape that seemed almost impossible. The air hurt when breathed too deeply. Water froze. Plants disappeared beneath the ground for part of the year. The days shortened. Wind moved across open country with almost nothing to stop it. And somewhere beyond the ridge, animals with thick fur wandered through the gray morning. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, reindeer, wild horses, bison. Farther away, predators followed them. Cave lions, hyenas, wolves. Human beings were entering a world that had been shaped by cold. And physically, they were poorly designed for it. A mammoth carried its insulation everywhere. A reindeer possessed a body adapted to winter. A woolly rhinoceros did not need to invent a coat. Humans had thin skin, exposed hands, vulnerable feet, and bodies that lost heat easily. Yet our ancestors moved deeper and deeper into Eurasia. They crossed landscapes where surviving one badly prepared winter could be difficult. And once again, the secret was not that the human body suddenly became perfect for the environment. The secret was that humans began building an environment around the body. A second skin, a portable shelter, a controlled flame, a social world strong enough to keep vulnerable people alive. If mobility had been one of humanity's first great survival technologies, cold forced another revolution. Clothing. At its simplest, clothing might begin with an animal hide draped over the shoulders. But there is a vast difference between carrying a skin and creating clothing designed to keep warm air close to the body. Anyone who has experienced severe winter understands why. Cold enters through openings. Wind finds gaps. Wet material removes heat rapidly. Feet become numb. Hands lose dexterity. A person who cannot use fingers properly cannot make tools, prepare food, tend a fire, or defend against danger. In cold environments, clothing becomes more than comfort. It becomes life support, The archaeological record cannot show us every coat or pair of shoes ever made. Leather, sinew, plant fiber, and fur usually decay. But surviving tools give us glimpses of increasingly sophisticated clothing technology. Bone awls could punch holes through hides. Later, carefully made-eyed needles allowed people to sew pieces together. A fitted garment could cover the body far more effectively than a loose skin. Several layers could trap warm air. Fur could be turned inward or outward, depending on conditions. Leg coverings protected areas especially exposed to cold. Footwear separated skin from frozen ground. Head coverings reduced heat loss. Mittens or wrapped hand coverings protected fingers. One small bone needle could therefore represent something enormous. It represented the ability to live where an unclothed human body could not. This was adaptation without waiting for biology. The climate changed. Humans changed their clothing, and suddenly new territory became possible. Still, clothing alone was not enough. Winter created another problem. Where do you sleep? A human being exposed to freezing wind overnight can lose heat quickly. Shelter therefore became just as important as clothing. Sometimes the landscape already provided protection. Caves and rock shelters offered natural walls. They could block wind and provide relatively stable temperatures. But caves were not everywhere. They could also be damp, dangerous, or occupied by animals. People needed alternatives. Across Ice Age landscapes, human communities developed ways to create shelter from materials available nearby. Wooden poles could form frames. Hides could block wind. Earth might be piled around edges for insulation. In some regions, large bones from mammoths and other animals were incorporated into structures. Whether every famous reconstruction of a mammoth bone dwelling looks exactly as the original once did is difficult to know. But the underlying principle is clear. Humans were no longer simply looking for environments that already met their needs. They were modifying local materials to create places where human bodies could survive. Think about what that means. A bird has a nest. A beaver builds a dam. Many animals alter their surroundings. But human beings became extraordinarily flexible builders because the design of their shelter was not fixed by instinct alone. It could be learned, adjusted, improved, copied. A shelter suitable for a dry grassland did not have to resemble a shelter built for winter. The blueprint existed inside culture. And then there was fire. Fire had been used by earlier human species long before Homo sapiens spread widely across the world. But in cold Eurasia, its importance becomes difficult to exaggerate. Imagine a winter night. Outside the shelter, the temperature continues to fall. Snow blows across the entrance. The landscape becomes almost completely dark. Predators move somewhere beyond the light. Inside, a flame burns. The fire creates a small circle of artificial climate. A few steps beyond it is the Ice Age. Within it is warmth. Meat can be cooked. Wet clothing can dry. Wooden tools can be hardened. Stone can be worked. Children can sleep near adults. People can speak. Stories can be told. Plans for tomorrow can be made. Fire lengthens the usable day. Without artificial light, winter darkness would sharply limit activity. With flame, human life continues after sunset. The group can repair tools when hunting is impossible. They can prepare hides. They can process food. They can teach. This matters because survival depends not only on having technology, but on maintaining it. A broken point must be replaced. A torn garment must be repaired. Fuel must be collected. Children must learn how these things are done. The hearth is therefore not simply a source of warmth. It is a workshop, a kitchen, a classroom, a social center, and perhaps, in ways difficult to measure, it is also where human memory becomes stronger. Around fire, knowledge can move between generations. Picture an older hunter who no longer runs as quickly as before. In purely physical terms, he might seem less useful than a younger adult. But he remembers 3 winters when the herds change direction. He knows where animals cross a frozen river. He knows which valley traps snow deeply and which ridge remains exposed. He can identify when wind has covered dangerous ice. He recognizes the tracks of predators. His value does not disappear when his muscles weaken. Knowledge makes old age useful in a new way. The colder and more unpredictable the environment, the more valuable memory becomes. A hunter moving across snow reads a landscape full of clues. A line of tracks can reveal what animal passed. Their depth may suggest the condition of the snow. Fresh edges can indicate how recently the tracks were made. Droppings reveal direction and perhaps diet. Broken vegetation shows movement. Wind erases evidence. New snowfall covers it. The person reading these signs is solving a constantly changing puzzle, and errors can be expensive. Follow the wrong trail, and valuable energy is wasted. Travel too far, and the group may return after dark. Cross unstable ice, and someone may fall through. Move into exposed terrain before a storm, and cold can become deadly. The Ice Age did not reward simple strength. It rewarded judgment. This is one reason the stereotype of prehistoric people as crude and thoughtless is so misleading. To survive in such environments required detailed knowledge of animal behavior, weather, geography, materials, and seasons. The landscape was not empty. It was information. Consider hunting mammoths. Popular images often show groups of humans dramatically surrounding a gigantic animal. Such hunts may have occurred in some places and times. But mammoth hunting was neither simple nor necessarily the everyday foundation of all Ice Age life. A mammoth is enormous. It is dangerous. It can injure or kill a human easily. A failed attempt wastes energy and risks lives. The people of the Cold World used many resources: reindeer, horses, bison, smaller mammals, birds, fish, plants when available, roots, seeds, nuts in suitable environments, shellfish near coasts. Humans did not survive by becoming dependent on one heroic style of big game hunting. They survived because they remained flexible. And even when large animals were hunted, success depended on cooperation. One person could track. Others could position themselves. Some could drive animals toward a narrow route. Others could wait in ambush. Tools could be thrown from a distance. Later technologies such as spear throwers increased the speed and range of projectiles. The advantage was not only physical, it was organizational. A group could create a plan and act together. Language made this much easier. Before a hunt, people could discuss where to stand. During travel, they could warn others about danger. After returning, they could describe where animals had been seen. A person who did not witness an event could still learn from it. This may sound ordinary because modern human life depends entirely on shared information, but it is one of the most extraordinary features of our survival strategy. Imagine 2 hunting groups. The first group discovers a distant valley where reindeer gather in late autumn. Only the hunters who saw it know this. When they die, the knowledge disappears. The second group can describe the valley. They can explain the route. They can teach younger people. They can attach the information to a story. Perhaps the story includes a distinctive mountain, a dangerous river crossing, and the behavior of animals at a particular season. Decades later, someone who has never met the original discoverer may still know where to go. Information has escaped the lifetime of one individual. That is cultural inheritance. And cultural inheritance changed the meaning of adaptation. A mammoth calf inherits genes from its parents. A human child inherits genes too. But the human child also inherits a world of accumulated instruction. How to start a fire, how to keep it alive, how to sharpen stone, how to prepare hides, how to find water, how to recognize dangerous clouds, how to behave around another group, how to divide food, how to care for an injured person, how to survive winter. Each generation begins with knowledge created before it was born. That accumulation allows cultural adaptation to accelerate. A small improvement in sewing can be preserved. A better stone blade can be copied. A new shelter design can spread. A more efficient hunting method can be taught. No one needs to reinvent everything. And the cold world constantly rewarded improvement. Winter also changed the meaning of planning. In tropical or mild environments, food availability can still fluctuate greatly, but extreme seasonal cold imposes a special rhythm. Some foods disappear during winter. Animals migrate. Plants become inaccessible. Daylight shrinks. A community that waits until food is already scarce may be in serious danger. Preparation must begin earlier. Meat can be dried. Fat can be preserved. Materials for tools can be collected. Hides can be processed. Fuel must be considered. Shelters must be prepared. This means humans are not merely reacting to what is happening now. They are acting because of what they believe will happen later. Autumn labor may be directed toward a winter that has not yet arrived. The future becomes part of daily decision-making. And winter teaches another lesson. Energy matters. Walking through snow costs energy. Keeping warm costs energy. Carrying materials costs energy. Hunting costs energy. A long journey that produces no food can be disastrous. The people who survived learned to read not just where resources existed, but when pursuing them was worth the effort. Sometimes the safest strategy was not to travel farther. Sometimes it was to remain sheltered. Sometimes it was to switch prey. Sometimes it was to consume stored food. Sometimes it was to move camp entirely. There was no single answer. The environment kept changing the question. Human flexibility kept producing new answers. But Homo sapiens were not alone in Eurasia. Other human populations had already lived in cold and temperate regions for immense spans of time. Among them were the Neanderthals. They were not primitive failures waiting for modern humans to replace them. Neanderthals survived repeated climatic shifts across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They made sophisticated stone tools. They controlled fire. They hunted large animals. They cared for injured individuals. They occupied cold landscapes long before Homo sapiens arrived in many of those regions. And when populations of Homo sapiens expanded into Eurasia, the two groups met. They interacted. They interbred. Today, many people whose ancestry lies outside Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal-derived DNA. This means the story of human survival is not a clean tale of one population entering an empty land. It is a story of encounters, competition in some circumstances, exchange perhaps in others, and biological mixing. Some genetic variants inherited from archaic humans may later have been useful in certain environments, including aspects of immunity and adaptation. Human survival, even at the level of biology, was partly a story of connection. Yet over time, Neanderthal populations disappeared as distinct populations. Exactly why remains debated. Climate stress may have played a role. Small and fragmented populations may have been vulnerable. Competition with expanding Homo sapiens may have mattered. Demography may have mattered. Disease may have mattered. Interbreeding itself blurred boundaries. There was probably no single cause. And this complexity is worth remembering. Prehistory rarely gives us simple endings. What we can say is that the Ice Age world was difficult for everyone. Homo sapiens did not enter Eurasia because conditions had become safe. They entered a landscape shaped by constant uncertainty. And somehow they continued. Perhaps part of their resilience came from broader social networks. Archaeologists sometimes find stone tools made from raw materials carried over surprisingly long distances. Shells appear far inland. Pigments and ornaments move between places. These objects suggest that prehistoric groups were not always isolated bands living without contact. People met. Materials traveled. Relationships crossed landscapes. And those relationships could become survival systems. Imagine that your local hunting grounds fail for a season. If your group has no connection beyond its immediate territory, your options shrink quickly. But if marriages, friendships, exchange relationships, or kinship connect you to another community, you may have somewhere to go. You may receive information, food, raw material, permission to use another region temporarily. Social networks convert geography into insurance. The farther useful relationships extend, the larger the effective survival territory becomes. A person does not need to personally know every valley if someone they trust knows someone who does. Information can travel farther than any one individual. This is a quiet kind of power. It leaves less dramatic evidence than a spear point. But it may have been more important. Because climate disaster is rarely uniform. A drought may devastate one valley while another receives rain. A herd may disappear from one region and gather somewhere else. A storm may destroy one camp while leaving another untouched. If people remain connected, local failure does not always become total failure. And connection was not only practical, it was cultural. By the Upper Paleolithic, some human communities were producing extraordinary art. Animals painted deep inside caves, carved figures, beads, pigments, decorated objects, musical instruments. The exact meanings of these creations are mostly beyond our reach. We should be cautious about claiming that a particular image represented a particular god, ritual, or myth. But the existence of art itself tells us something profound. People struggling with Ice Age conditions were not living only from one meal to the next. They were making symbols. They were decorating bodies. They were creating objects whose value cannot be explained only by calories. They were communicating identity, perhaps belonging, perhaps memory. Perhaps stories about animals, places, ancestors, or forces they believed shaped the world. A community under climatic stress still found time to sing, still found time to carve, still found time to paint. This matters because human resilience is not purely mechanical. A group is more than bodies needing food. People need relationships, meaning, belonging, trust, shared expectations. A symbol can help establish who belongs to a community. A story can preserve a warning. A ritual can bring people together. An ornament can communicate identity to strangers. Culture may therefore strengthen cooperation, and cooperation strengthens survival. Now imagine another winter evening. Snow has been falling since afternoon. The entrance to the shelter has been partly blocked to stop the wind. Inside, the fire throws orange light across the walls. Several people are working. One is scraping a hide. Another repairs the stone point of a hunting weapon. Someone twists fiber into cord. A child watches an older relative push a bone needle through leather. Meat cooks near the flame. Outside, the temperature continues to fall. A wolf howls somewhere in the darkness. The child looks toward the sound. An adult says something reassuring. Perhaps then a story begins. Maybe it is about a hunt. Maybe about a place far away. Maybe about a winter when the snow came unusually early. The child listens. Years later, perhaps that child will repeat the same story to another generation. Inside those words may be information. Do not cross the river when the ice looks dark. Follow the valley when the northern wind begins. The herds appear after the first deep snow. There is shelter beyond the ridge. What sounds like entertainment may also be an archive. And that leads us to one of the central themes of this entire journey. Human beings can store survival outside individual experience. Not yet in books. Not yet in databases. But in other minds. A single person cannot live through enough climate cycles to learn everything. A community can. An old person remembers one crisis. Another remembers a different one. Stories preserve events from before the youngest listeners were born. The group becomes older than any individual. Culture gives humanity a memory longer than one lifetime. And soon, that would become crucial. Because the Ice Age was not simply cold. It was unstable. Temperatures shifted. Rainfall changed. Forests advanced and retreated. Grasslands expanded and contracted. Ice sheets grew and shrank. Sometimes these changes were slow enough to unfold across many generations. But at other times, the climate could change startlingly fast. A landscape familiar in childhood might not remain the same by old age. The routes of animals could change. Vegetation could reorganize. Water sources could move. And communities that had mastered one set of conditions could suddenly discover that yesterday's knowledge was no longer enough. This was the deeper challenge, not merely learning how to survive cold, but learning how to survive a world that refused to remain one thing. Somewhere in Ice Age Eurasia, a person could stand at the edge of a valley and remember trees where there were now open grasslands. An elder could describe animals that younger hunters rarely saw. A trail used for decades might lead to nothing. A river might freeze differently. A season might arrive at the wrong time. The people who adapted best would not be those who memorized one perfect way of life. They would be those capable of changing their behavior when the old patterns failed. And this flexibility was about to be tested more severely than ever. Because the next chapter of human climate history was not a story of a stable frozen world. It was a story of violent climatic swings. Warmth, cold, dryness, recovery, then another reversal, again and again, sometimes within the span of generations, perhaps even quickly enough for a single human lifetime to contain memories of two very different worlds. And in that unstable world, an unexpected technology would become one of humanity's greatest defenses against climate. Not a spear, not a needle, not even fire. It was the ability to remember together. There are slow changes that transform a world so gradually that no single generation notices the beginning. A forest thins. A lake becomes shallower. A coastline shifts. An animal becomes less common. Each year is only slightly different from the year before. Then there are changes that arrive quickly enough to become memory. An elder can point across a valley and say that when he was a child, trees grew there. A hunter can remember a time when reindeer passed close to camp every autumn. A woman can describe winters that once began later. Parents can tell children that the river did not always freeze this way. During parts of the Pleistocene, human beings lived through climatic changes of exactly this kind. Not merely cold periods and warm periods separated by immense spans of geological time, but abrupt swings. The climate could shift rapidly enough that human communities were forced to rethink how they lived before old knowledge had even faded from memory. To understand what that felt like, imagine a valley somewhere in Eurasia during the Ice Age. A river runs through its center. Low trees grow along the banks. In spring, meltwater spreads across the floodplain. Herds visit the open grass. People know where animals cross the river. They know which slopes remain protected from winter wind. They know where edible plants return when snow disappears. They know where stones suitable for tools can be collected. It is not an easy life, but it is a known life. Then the climate begins to change. Perhaps winters become colder. Perhaps rainfall patterns shift. The trees do not recover as strongly after one severe season. The following year is colder again. The grassland spreads farther into the valley. Animals begin arriving at different times. Some no longer appear at all. At first, the people adjust. They always have. They move camp a little earlier. They hunt farther away. They gather different foods. But then several difficult years come close together. The world that once seemed reliable becomes uncertain. This was one of the defining realities of late Pleistocene life. Climate records preserved in ancient ice, ocean sediments, caves, lake beds, and other natural archives reveal that the Ice Age climate was capable of dramatic fluctuations. In the North Atlantic region especially, scientists have identified repeated episodes of abrupt warming and cooling. Some warming events unfolded astonishingly quickly by geological standards. Temperatures in parts of Greenland rose by several degrees within decades, perhaps even faster during particular transitions. Then colder conditions returned. These events did not affect every place in the same way. Climate is never that simple. A shift in the North Atlantic could influence rainfall elsewhere. Monsoon systems changed. Vegetation zones moved. Habitats expanded and contracted. The precise experience of a human group depended on where that group lived. But the broader lesson is clear. For many prehistoric communities, there was no permanent environmental normal. The normal condition was change. This creates a particular kind of evolutionary challenge. If one environment remains stable for a very long time, specialization can be powerful. An animal can become extremely efficient at eating one food, hunting one prey, living within one narrow climate. But specialization has a weakness. When the environment changes, excellence can become vulnerability. A body beautifully adapted to one world may perform poorly in the next. Human beings followed another path. We became astonishingly general. Our teeth were not perfect for only one food. Our hands were not limited to one task. Our behavior was not locked into one hunting method. Our shelters were not genetically fixed. Our clothing could change. Our tools could change. Our social arrangements could change. In other words, humans increasingly adapted by changing culture faster than nature could redesign the body. Imagine 3 generations living through one climatic transition. The grandfather grows up when the valley is more wooded. He learns to hunt animals that prefer that habitat. He knows where they feed. He knows when fruit ripens. He knows where the river overflows. His son grows up during transition. The old patterns still exist, but they become less reliable. He must combine the knowledge of his father with observations of new conditions. His daughter grows up in a colder, drier landscape. She knows fewer trees. Different animals dominate. Some of her grandfather's knowledge sounds almost like a story about another country. Yet that old knowledge may still matter, because the climate might shift again. This is why memory becomes so important. A single person's experience is limited, but a community can preserve experience beyond individual lifetimes. The oldest people may remember rare events that younger adults have never seen. An unusual drought, a severe winter, a flood, a year when animals failed to arrive, a distant refuge used once in childhood. Under stable conditions, such memories may seem unimportant. Under unstable conditions, they can become priceless. Consider a drought. For 20 years, a certain spring has provided water. Children grow up believing it is permanent. Then one year it weakens. Another year it disappears. The younger people may know no alternative, but an elderly woman remembers another drought from long ago. When she was small, her family traveled several days toward a limestone ridge. There was a narrow ravine there. At the bottom was a pool that remained shaded. Her parents told her that the pool rarely dried completely. She has not visited that place in decades. Perhaps she is not even certain that the route remains the same. But the group has little choice. They follow her memory. That memory may save them. In a world without writing, older people could function as archives of environmental history. This does not mean every story was perfectly accurate. Human memory changes. Stories become exaggerated. Details disappear. But even imperfect information can provide direction. The knowledge that water once existed beyond a certain ridge may be enough to justify a search. The memory that animals move south during an earlier cold period may suggest where hunters should look. The warning that a frozen lake broke unusually early during one warm spring may prevent someone from crossing at the wrong time. Experience becomes insurance, and language makes this insurance transferable. Language allows humans to describe things that are not present. This is an extraordinary ability. A wolf can signal danger. Many animals communicate food, alarm, territory, and social information. But human language can tell you about a water source you have never seen, a storm that happened before you were born, a mountain beyond the horizon, a winter that may come next year. A person can say in effect, when the sky behaves like this, prepare. When the animals stop appearing here, go there. When the river falls below that rock, leave. The event does not need to be happening now. It can exist first in words. That makes language a climate technology, not because language changes the weather, because it changes how a community responds to weather. And this brings us to another important survival system: social networks. A prehistoric group might contain only a few dozen people. Such a community could be deeply knowledgeable about its territory. But small groups are vulnerable. A few deaths can remove important skills. A local food failure can become serious. A disease can reduce numbers. Bad luck can strike everyone at once. Isolation magnifies risk. Connections with other groups reduce it. Imagine that your community hunts in one river valley. Another group lives 2 days away. A third lives beyond a low mountain pass. You do not see them every week, perhaps only during certain seasons. Perhaps people from the different communities marry. Perhaps gatherings take place when food is abundant. Perhaps stone, pigments, ornaments, animal hides, and stories move between them. Those relationships create something larger than any one camp, a network. If your hunting fails, another group may know where animals have moved. If your water disappears, someone farther away may tell you which river still flows. If a storm destroys your shelter, relatives elsewhere may take you in. If an important toolstone source becomes inaccessible, exchange can bring material from another region. Archaeologists sometimes find objects surprisingly far from the places where their raw materials originated. High-quality stone may travel many tens or hundreds of kilometers. Marine shells can appear far inland. Pigments and decorative objects move across landscapes. An object that traveled far does not tell us exactly how it moved. One person might have carried it. It might have passed from group to group. It may have been exchanged, given as a gift, carried during seasonal migration. But long-distance movement suggests connections. And connections matter enormously when environments become unstable. Imagine a severe winter in one valley. Snow arrives early. Game becomes scarce. The group has little stored food. The easiest response might seem to be moving toward another known territory. But what if another community already uses it? This is where social relationships become as important as geography. A rich valley is useless if entering it leads immediately to conflict. A poorer region inhabited by relatives may be safer. Humans therefore had to manage not only landscapes, but relationships. Hospitality could become survival. Marriage could become survival. Gift exchange could become survival. Maintaining contact during good years could create options during bad years. This is a form of risk management that feels remarkably familiar. Modern societies build emergency reserves, insurance systems, communication networks, and alliances. Prehistoric people did not use those words. But the underlying problem was the same. How do you survive a crisis that strikes your local world? One answer is to make your local world larger. Social networks did exactly that. They expanded the territory of information. A person might know one valley intimately, but if that person knows someone who knows another valley, the effective map becomes larger. If those two groups know a third group, it becomes larger still. Knowledge travels. Warnings travel. Ideas travel. New technology can travel too. Suppose one group discovers a more effective way to attach a stone point to a wooden shaft. Another develops better clothing. Another learns to preserve food in a particular way. If groups never meet, every innovation remains local. If groups exchange people and information, useful ideas can spread. Cultural networks therefore act like nervous systems across the landscape. A discovery made in one place can eventually influence survival far away. This may help explain why increasing social and symbolic complexity became so important among Homo sapiens. Beads, pigments, carved objects, and ornaments might look unnecessary from the narrow perspective of survival. They provide no calories. They do not stop snow. They do not kill prey. But symbols can carry social information. They may indicate group identity, status, affiliation, shared tradition. A person approaching strangers while wearing a recognizable ornament may communicate something before speaking. Perhaps the object says, I come from people you know. I belong to a network connected with yours. I am not entirely unknown. We should be cautious because we cannot reconstruct the exact meanings of prehistoric ornaments. But identity has practical value. Trust has practical value. And any cultural system that helps people maintain wider relationships may increase resilience. The same is true of gatherings. When groups meet, more than material objects move. People observe techniques. They learn songs. They exchange stories. They hear where animals were seen. They learn which areas are dry. They discover that another region had a mild winter. They may arrange future partnerships. Children see people from beyond their immediate family. Young adults form relationships. Information spreads through conversation. A gathering can function as a social event, an economic exchange, and an environmental information network at the same time. Now imagine the climate shifts again. A generation of relative warmth ends. Winter intensifies. Vegetation changes. The animals everyone expected do not arrive. A small, isolated community has only its own memory. A connected community has more. Someone remembers a story told by visitors 2 years earlier. Farther west, there is a river basin where animals remained abundant during a previous cold season. The journey is difficult, but it is possible. This is how survival often works, not as one dramatic rescue, as a chain of information. Someone noticed. Someone remembered. Someone told another person. Someone believed the story. Someone decided to move. And because of that sequence, children live through winter. There is another subtle advantage of human social life. Different people know different things. One person may be an exceptional tracker. Another knows plants. Another is skilled at shaping stone. Another understands hides. Another remembers distant routes. Another is especially good at making fire under wet conditions. Another knows how to calm frightened children during a dangerous journey. A human community does not require every individual to master every skill. Knowledge can be distributed. This creates collective intelligence. The group becomes more capable than any single member. And when the environment changes, diversity of knowledge becomes valuable. Suppose hunting becomes unreliable. The most celebrated hunter may suddenly have less to offer. But the person who knows how to gather difficult plant foods becomes crucial. Suppose the group moves to a coast. Someone familiar with shellfish and tides becomes valuable. Suppose they enter colder ground. A skilled clothing maker may save more lives than the strongest hunter. Environmental instability changes which knowledge matters. Flexible societies can change with it. This may be one reason Homo sapiens became so successful across so many environments. Our survival system was not built around one perfect specialist. It was built around groups containing many kinds of knowledge, and that knowledge was teachable. Children were central to the entire process. A human child is unusually dependent for a long time. This appears at first to be a weakness. Children require food, protection, warmth, instruction. They cannot quickly become independent. But a long childhood creates time for learning. A child watches adults make tools, learns how to behave with other people, observes seasonal movements, practices identifying tracks, experiments with materials, listens to stories, learns language, learns the invisible rules of the community. By adulthood, that person carries a vast library of cultural information. Then the process begins again. This is not simply survival from one winter to the next. It is survival through continuity. Knowledge survives because children carry it forward. and some of that knowledge can remain useful for generations. Think again of the unstable valley. The climate has become colder. The grandfather remembers forest. The daughter knows grassland. The granddaughter may see forest return. None of them lives long enough to understand the full climatic cycle. But if they tell stories to one another, the community can remember more than any one lifetime. This is collective memory. And collective memory may be one of humanity's oldest defenses against uncertainty. It allows the past to warn the future. Perhaps somewhere beside an ancient fire, a child once heard a story that sounded strange. The story spoke of a time when animals came from the north, of a river that once flooded farther than anyone had seen, of people who lived beyond a ridge now considered empty. Years passed. The child became an adult. Then the climate changed. The river fell. Animals vanished. The old story suddenly became useful. That person followed the remembered route. Maybe the story was imperfect. Maybe several details were wrong. But beyond the ridge there was water. If so, the story was more than entertainment. It was a survival tool carried through time. This is why the human response to climate cannot be reduced to stronger weapons or better shelters. Technology mattered, but culture itself was technology. Language was technology. Kinship was technology. Memory was technology. Trust was technology. A relationship maintained during times of plenty could save a family during famine. A story repeated beside a fire could guide people decades later. A child taught carefully could become the keeper of information after the teacher died. The people living through Pleistocene climate swings did not understand atmospheric circulation. They did not know about orbital cycles. They had no temperature records. But they understood patterns. They watched. They remembered. They compared one year with another. They talked to others. They noticed when familiar signs no longer worked. That last ability may have been the most important, because knowledge can become dangerous when people refuse to update it. A valley that once contained food may become empty. A migration route may fail. A spring may dry permanently. The past can guide survival, but only if humans are willing to abandon old habits when evidence changes. This is where flexibility returns. The ideal strategy was not simply to remember. It was to remember and revise. Keep what still works. Change what does not. That sounds simple when stated calmly. In real life, it means leaving familiar ground, trying unfamiliar food, trusting strangers, changing hunting methods, watching old expertise become less valuable, teaching children a way of life different from the one you learned. That is emotionally difficult. Human beings form attachments to places and routines. Prehistoric people surely did too. A valley could contain memories. A cave could contain generations of occupation. A river could be part of a community's identity. To leave such places was not merely to move camp. It may have meant leaving part of the known world behind. Yet time after time, humans moved. And because they moved, connected, remembered, and adapted, Homo sapiens expanded into almost every kind of environment on Earth. But climatic instability was not the only danger in prehistory. Sometimes disruption came not from the gradual rhythm of seasons or distant changes in ocean circulation. Sometimes it came from deep beneath the ground. Around 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia, a volcanic system produced one of the largest eruptions known from the recent geological past, the Toba eruption. Its ash spread across enormous distances. Its gases reached high into the atmosphere. For decades, scientists have debated how severe its global effects were and what those effects meant for human populations. Did it create a catastrophic volcanic winter? Did it nearly drive Homo sapiens to extinction? Or were human populations more resilient and its climatic impact more complicated than once imagined? The answer remains uncertain. And that uncertainty makes the event even more interesting, because Toba forces us to ask a deeper question. What happens when the disaster is not only cold or drought? What happens when the sky itself changes? When daylight weakens? When ash falls? When familiar seasons become unreliable? When no one alive has ever seen anything like it before? Somewhere, nearly 74,000 years ago, human beings may have looked upward and watched a strange haze spread across the sun. And for communities living downwind of one of the greatest eruptions of the Pleistocene, the world was about to become darker. Imagine a morning when the sun rises, but the world does not brighten. The horizon glows faintly. The sky is there. The sun is there. And yet something is wrong. Its light appears weak. The air carries dust. The color of the morning is unfamiliar. Animals behave strangely. People look upward. No one understands what has happened. Far beyond the horizon, farther than anyone in the group has ever traveled, a mountain has torn itself apart. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba volcanic system on the island of Sumatra produced one of the largest known eruptions of the last several million years. The explosion was enormous. Vast quantities of volcanic material were thrown into the atmosphere. Ash spread across huge regions. Chemical compounds reached high altitudes. The landscape close to the eruption was devastated. Much farther away, the effects were less obvious, but potentially far more widespread. For human communities living in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and other regions, Toba has become one of the most intriguing events in the story of prehistoric survival. For many years, a dramatic idea captured the imagination. Perhaps the eruption caused a severe volcanic winter. Perhaps global temperatures fell sharply. Perhaps vegetation collapsed. Perhaps animal populations declined. Perhaps Homo sapiens came dangerously close to extinction. It is a powerful story, but science has become more cautious. Evidence collected from archaeological sites, lake sediments, ice cores, climate models, and genetic studies has complicated the picture. There is no simple agreement that Toba nearly wiped out humanity. Some human populations appear to have persisted through the period. In certain regions, archaeological evidence suggests continuity rather than complete abandonment. The climatic effects may have varied greatly from place to place. So we should not imagine every human community on Earth standing beneath a black sky at the same moment, waiting for extinction. The truth is probably more subtle, and perhaps more interesting. Toba was certainly extraordinary. Its effects were potentially severe, but human beings were already living in diverse environments, using diverse strategies. And those differences may have determined who suffered most and who found ways to endure. To understand the danger, it helps to understand what a very large volcanic eruption can do. When a volcano erupts explosively, ash can be thrown into the atmosphere. Much of that ash eventually falls back to Earth. Close to the source, it may bury landscapes. Farther away, ash can travel great distances. But ash is only part of the story. Powerful eruptions can also inject sulfur-rich gases into the upper atmosphere. There, these gases can form tiny particles that reflect some incoming sunlight back into space. The effect can temporarily cool the surface. Modern eruptions have shown this mechanism clearly. The larger the eruption, the greater the potential for climatic disturbance. But the exact outcome depends on many factors. How much sulfur was released? How high did it travel? At what latitude? What was the state of the climate before the eruption? How did oceans and atmospheric circulation respond? These questions are difficult enough for recent eruptions. For an event 74,000 years ago, uncertainty becomes unavoidable. Yet imagine what even a modest sequence of abnormal seasons would mean to a small prehistoric community. There are no grain shipments from another continent. No emergency government reserves. No weather satellites. No hospitals stocked with medicine. No transportation network capable of moving food across thousands of miles. If sunlight decreases and temperatures fall, plant growth may weaken. If rain changes, water sources may fail. If grasses decline, herbivores may move. If herbivores move, hunters must move too. A climatic disturbance does not need to kill people directly. It only needs to damage enough parts of the food web. The crisis begins with small absences. The fruits appear late. The seeds are fewer. Animals arrive in smaller numbers. A familiar herd does not return. A water source becomes unreliable. The group waits. Perhaps the following season will improve. But what if it does not? In a hunter-gatherer world, survival is built from many daily calculations. How much energy should be spent searching? Should people remain near a familiar water source? Should they travel toward another group? Should they hunt large animals or focus on smaller prey? Should they move toward a river? Toward the coast? Toward a wetland? Toward higher ground? The answer might decide whether children survive the season. Once again, flexibility becomes more important than specialization. Imagine two communities separated by several days of travel. The first depends heavily on one migrating herd. For generations, those animals have provided meat, fat, hides, bone, and sinew. The community is extremely skilled at hunting them. The people understand the herd's movements almost perfectly. Their tools are designed around that way of life. Their seasonal movements follow the animals. Under normal conditions, this is an efficient system. Then the climate shifts. Vegetation changes. The herd alters its route. Perhaps numbers decline. Expertise becomes less useful. The second community also hunts, but it lives near a river and not far from the coast. People catch fish. They gather shellfish. They collect edible plants. They trap smaller animals. They use seasonal resources that appear at different times. No single food is sufficient all year, but together they form a broad safety net. If one resource fails, another may remain. This does not guarantee survival. No strategy does. But diversity creates options. And in times of crisis, options are life. Coastal environments are particularly interesting in this story. For much of the 20th century, popular images of early human life focus strongly on big game hunting. The heroic hunter dominated the scene. But archaeological research increasingly reveals that some prehistoric humans made use of shorelines, shellfish, fish, and other aquatic resources. These foods could provide important nutritional advantages. More importantly, for climate resilience, coastal and aquatic environments can behave differently from inland ecosystems. A drought that reduces terrestrial plants may not affect every marine resource in the same way. A decline in one species may be balanced by another. Tidal zones renew themselves. Shellfish do not require humans to chase them across the landscape. Rivers concentrate life. Wetlands can support fish, birds, plants, reptiles, and mammals. Water environments create ecological variety, and ecological variety provides alternatives. Picture a group walking at low tide along a rocky shore. Children search among pools. Adults pry shellfish from stone. Others watch for fish trapped in shallow water. Someone carries a sharpened stick. Someone gathers edible sea plants. The meal is not dramatic. There is no giant mammoth hunt. No heroic confrontation with a predator. But perhaps that is precisely the point. Survival is often built from undramatic food. Reliable food. Food that does not require a person to risk being crushed by a huge animal. A basket of shellfish can matter more than a legend. The same principle applies inland. Rivers and lakes can act as refuges during ecological disruption. Fish remain available when certain land animals move away. Wetlands contain plants. Birds gather there. Animals come to drink. Even during dry periods, some river systems preserve pockets of life. A group capable of shifting between hunting, fishing, gathering, and scavenging possesses multiple pathways through a crisis. This behavioral flexibility had been developing long before Toba. But events like large eruptions remind us why it mattered. A species built around one narrow solution is vulnerable to sudden change. A species capable of experimentation has another chance. There may also have been another advantage: mobility. If conditions deteriorate locally, moving may be the only effective response. Humans were already capable of long-distance movement. They understood landscapes. They followed rivers. They crossed open country. They maintained contact with neighboring groups. During a regional crisis, these networks could become evacuation routes. Perhaps news moved before people did. A visiting group might report that water was still plentiful farther south. Hunters returning from a long journey might describe animals gathering in another valley. Relatives might offer temporary access to another territory. The decision to migrate still carried danger, but a socially connected group did not have to move blindly. This is where the invisible technologies of humanity appear once again. Language, memory, trust, reciprocity, information. You cannot preserve these in volcanic ash the way you preserve a stone tool. But without them, many stone tools would have been useless. What good is a sharp blade if you do not know where food has moved? What good is a spear if no animals remain nearby? What good is physical strength if your group refuses to cooperate? The most important adaptations are not always the easiest to excavate. Now imagine the first season after the eruption. Perhaps the sky remains hazy. Perhaps sunsets turn unusual colors. Perhaps temperatures become less predictable. No one in the group knows why. There is no concept of a volcanic aerosol. No understanding of atmospheric chemistry. People interpret the event using the world of stories and experiences available to them. But understanding the physical mechanism is not necessary for practical adaptation. They know enough to notice. The season is wrong. Animals are moving differently. Certain plants have failed. The water tastes of ash. Whatever explanation they give, they must respond. A family that waits for the old pattern to return may lose precious time. Another group begins experimenting. A plant once considered a minor food is gathered more often. Children are taught to collect shellfish. Hunters target smaller prey. Travel becomes more frequent. People eat foods that would have been ignored in better years. This is one of the central truths of prehistoric resilience. A crisis changes the definition of valuable. Food that once seemed undesirable becomes important. An old route becomes useful again. A distant relative becomes essential. A forgotten spring becomes a destination. Skills that seem secondary become central. The hierarchy of knowledge changes with the environment. And perhaps the strongest communities are those that allow this change to happen. Consider the role of experimentation. Trying something new is risky. Unknown foods can be dangerous. New territory may contain predators or hostile groups. A new hunting technique can fail. But refusing experimentation can be even more dangerous when old methods collapse. Human culture evolved in tension between tradition and innovation. Tradition preserves proven knowledge. Innovation allows adaptation when that knowledge stops working. Too much of one can be dangerous. If every generation abandons old experience, valuable lessons disappear. If every generation refuses new ideas, changing environments become impossible to survive. Human resilience depends on balancing both. Remember, then experiment. That balance may have been especially important during environmental shocks. There is a tendency to imagine prehistoric survival as a competition in which only the toughest individuals lived. But crises often punish isolation. A person who hoards information may weaken the group. A hunter who refuses to share food may gain temporarily, but damage future cooperation. A family that rejects all outsiders may have nowhere to go when its own territory fails. Long-term survival favors relationships. This does not mean prehistoric communities were peaceful utopias. Conflict existed. Competition existed. Violence existed. Resources could become scarce enough to create tension. But cooperation existed alongside conflict, and its importance should not be underestimated. Humans repeatedly survived conditions that were difficult for individuals precisely because they were not living as isolated individuals. A child did not need to catch its own food. An injured adult could sometimes be supported. An older person could contribute knowledge rather than physical power. A skilled toolmaker could provide equipment for others. Food could be distributed. Labor could be divided. A crisis that would kill a solitary human might be manageable for a coordinated group. Now think about genetic evidence. At one time, researchers proposed that Toba might have caused a dramatic population bottleneck in Homo sapiens. A bottleneck occurs when a population becomes very small, reducing genetic diversity. Some genetic patterns in modern humans were interpreted as possibly consistent with such an event. But linking genetic bottlenecks directly to one eruption is extremely difficult. Population size can change for many reasons. Human groups were structured across Africa and beyond. Different populations may have expanded, contracted, separated, and mixed repeatedly. Modern genetic evidence does not provide a simple signature saying that Toba nearly ended our species. Archaeology also complicates the extinction narrative. At sites in parts of India, stone tool traditions appear on both sides of volcanic ash layers associated with Toba. This suggests that humans, or human populations, using similar technologies, continue to occupy at least some areas after the eruption. In Africa, evidence likewise does not support a straightforward picture of universal collapse. This does not mean Toba was harmless. It means human experience was probably uneven. Some communities may have suffered terribly. Others may have encountered relatively limited effects. Some landscapes may have recovered quickly. Others may have taken longer. This unevenness is itself a lesson. Global events are experienced locally. A great eruption can affect continents, yet survival still depends on the valley, coast, river, forest, social network, and decisions available to a particular group. There was no single human experience of Toba. There were thousands. Most are lost. We do not know the names of those who watched ash fall. We do not know what stories they told. We do not know how many families moved. We do not know which experiments failed. We do not know how many people died before finding a refuge. The archaeological record is silent about almost every individual moment. But we know something simple. Humanity continued. Children were born after Toba. They grew. They learned. They had children of their own. Somewhere, someone kept a fire alive. Someone found water. Someone discovered that a familiar food still grew in a sheltered place. Someone followed a river. Someone shared information. Someone took strangers into a camp. Someone decided not to wait for the old world to return. Survival continued through decisions too small to enter geology. And when viewed across thousands of years, those decisions formed a pattern. Diversity created resilience. The more foods a community knew, the more options it had. The more landscapes it understood, the more places it could go. The more social connections it maintained, the more information it could access. The more skills it preserved, the more ways it could respond. This principle extends far beyond volcanic disasters. It explains much of the human story. We survived not by becoming perfect for one world. We survived by refusing to depend completely on one world. Perhaps that is the most useful way to remember Toba. Not as the volcano that certainly almost destroyed humanity. The evidence does not justify that certainty, but as a reminder of how vulnerable small prehistoric populations could be to sudden environmental disruption, and of how survival depended on having alternatives. If large game vanished, there were fish. If inland resources failed, there might be a coast. If one valley dried, another might remain wet. If one family lacked knowledge, another might remember. If the familiar way of life failed, humans could attempt another. The sky eventually cleared. Ash settled. Seasons continued. Vegetation returned in many regions. Animals adjusted. People did too. And over the tens of thousands of years that followed, Homo sapiens expanded farther across the planet, into deserts, across mountains, along coasts, across grasslands, into high latitudes, and deeper into the cold. By around 26,000 years ago, the planet was entering one of the harshest phases of the most recent ice age. Ice sheets expanded over enormous areas of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels fell. Cold, dry landscapes spread. Entire regions became difficult or impossible to inhabit. Human populations withdrew into refuges. Coastlines moved far from their modern positions. Land bridges emerged from the sea. The map of the world changed. This was the last glacial maximum, a time when glaciers held so much of Earth's water that the ocean stood more than 100 meters below their modern level. A time when the cold did not arrive for one season. It remained for generations, and humanity would once again face the ancient question: how do you live when the world you know becomes smaller, colder, and harder? The answer would involve better tools, better shelters, more careful planning, wider networks, and something else, something almost surprising. In one of the coldest periods of human prehistory, people did not merely survive. They painted, they carved, they made music, they created beauty beneath the shadow of the ice. Imagine standing on a plain that no longer exists. The horizon is wide. The air is dry. Grass bends beneath a cold wind. Far to the north, enormous ice sheets cover lands that, in another age, will hold cities, roads, farms, and forests. But none of those things exist yet. Much of northern Europe is buried beneath ice. Vast parts of northern North America are covered as well. Mountain glaciers descend into valleys. Winter is long. Summer is brief. And so much water has been locked into ice that the oceans have fallen far below their modern shores. The coastline is not where you know it today. It may lie many kilometers farther away. Places now submerged beneath the North Sea, the Bering Strait, and the shallow seas of Southeast Asia are dry land. Rivers flow across plains that will one day disappear beneath waves. Animals migrate through valleys that future generations will never see. Human families build fires on ground now buried beneath the ocean. This was the world of the last glacial maximum. Roughly between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, global ice volume reached one of its greatest recent peaks. The Earth was colder than today. Much of the climate was also drier. Deserts expanded in some regions. Forests retreated. Open steppe and tundra spread across enormous areas. In the far north, living conditions became extremely difficult. Human populations did not simply continue occupying every place they had known before. In some regions, they withdrew. They concentrated in areas where food, water, shelter, and seasonal movement remained possible. These places are often called refugia. A refugium was not necessarily warm. It did not need to be comfortable. It only needed to be survivable. In Europe, parts of the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, the Balkans, and other southern or sheltered regions offered relatively better conditions than lands farther north. Human populations could persist there while enormous ice sheets dominated more northerly areas. In Asia, people survived in steppe regions, river valleys, mountain margins, deserts, and coastal zones. Different communities found different solutions. And once again, there was no single Ice Age lifestyle. Popular imagination often reduces this period to mammoth hunters. It is easy to understand why. Mammoths were magnificent. They were enormous. Their bones survived dramatically. Their image fits perfectly into the idea of an Ice Age wilderness. But the human diet was much broader. People hunted large animals where those animals were available. They also caught fish, collected plants, gathered nuts, dug roots, hunted birds and smaller mammals, used shellfish near the coast, exploited local resources that differed enormously from one region to another. In other words, the people who survived the last glacial maximum did not do so by placing all their hope in one animal. They survived through flexibility. Imagine a family moving across a cold plain. A hunter carries stone blades and a wooden weapon. Another person carries hides. A child holds a piece of bone. Someone has cordage made from twisted fibers or sinew. The group knows where fuel can be found. That knowledge matters because open steppe does not always provide easy access to large pieces of wood. Bones may sometimes be used as fuel. Small shrubs can be gathered. Dung may become valuable in certain environments. Anything capable of producing heat can matter when temperature falls. The most ordinary materials become strategic resources. Cold transforms priorities. A person living in a milder climate may think first about food and water. In severe cold, shelter and insulation become equally urgent. One night of exposure can be catastrophic. Clothing must remain functional. Footwear matters. A wet garment can become dangerous. A torn seam must be repaired. This is where the humble needle becomes one of the great technologies of prehistory. Bone needles allowed people to produce fitted clothing with greater precision. Layers could trap warm air. Hoods could protect the head. Sleeves could protect arms. Leg coverings and footwear could reduce exposure. A human body that had evolved without thick fur could now carry its own artificial insulation. Think of what this means in evolutionary terms. A cold-adapted animal must wait for biological change across generations. Humans could create insulation in a workshop beside a fire. Culture moved faster than genes. And clothing was only one part of a larger technological system. Stoneworking became increasingly refined in many communities. Blades could be produced efficiently from prepared cores. Bone, antler, ivory, and wood could be shaped into specialized tools. Spear throwers increased the force and range of thrown weapons in some regions. Cordage allowed people to tie, bind, carry, trap, and construct. Nets, snares, and other perishable technologies may have been far more important than the surviving archaeological record suggests. Food could be processed and preserved. Shelters could be strengthened. Raw materials could be transported over long distances. The Ice Age human toolkit was not a collection of isolated inventions. It was a system. A blade could cut hide. A needle could turn that hide into clothing. Cordage could tie shelter frames. Fire could warm the shelter. Stored food could support people when hunting failed. Each tool supported another. Survival came from the combination. This kind of technology also required planning. You do not make winter clothing after freezing conditions arrive. You prepare before them. You do not wait until prey disappears before thinking about stored food. You preserve abundance when it exists. You repair tools before a journey. You gather raw materials before leaving the place where they can be found. The future becomes part of present behavior. And planning is especially important in a landscape where travel is expensive. Cold increases energy demands. Walking through snow takes effort. Carrying supplies takes effort. Hunting takes effort. A failed expedition can cost more calories than it returns. People therefore had to become careful economists of energy without ever using such language. Where should a camp be placed? Close to water? Protected from wind? Near animal roots? Near fuel? Near stone? No single location provides everything. Choosing where to live is a calculation, and those calculations could change seasonally. A place excellent in summer might be dangerous in winter. A river crossing safe in 1 month might be impossible in another. The successful community did not simply know the land. It knew the land through time. Seasonal knowledge was a map layered over a map. There was the valley in spring, the valley in summer, the valley in autumn, the valley beneath winter snow. Each was almost a different place. This knowledge could become especially powerful when combined with social networks. During the last glacial maximum, populations in some regions may have become more separated because huge areas were less habitable. Isolation can be dangerous. Small communities are vulnerable to demographic accidents. A few deaths may eliminate important skills. If numbers fall too low, finding partners becomes difficult. Genetic diversity can decline. Social contact therefore becomes essential. Objects found far from their geological sources suggest that materials and perhaps ideas continued to travel across significant distances. Shells appeared inland. Stone moved between regions. Ornaments circulated. These movements are evidence not simply of trade, but of connection. A bead can be a social signal. A piece of stone can mark a relationship. A gathering can exchange both people and information. And in difficult climates, relationships become survival infrastructure. Now imagine winter deepening. Snow covers the ground outside a shelter. Inside, several families share a protected space. The fire is small but steady. Someone is shaping a bone point. Another person scrapes a hide. A child watches an adult twist fibers. An older person tells a story. Outside, mammoths move somewhere in darkness. Inside, another kind of survival is happening. Knowledge is being transferred. This scene matters because the Ice Age was survived not only by hunters in moments of danger. It was survived during long hours of maintenance, repair, teaching, food preparation, childcare, gathering fuel, processing hides, sharpening tools, checking traps, drying meat, remembering routes. Most survival is repetitive. Most survival is quiet. History often preserves the spectacular act, the successful hunt, the dramatic migration, the giant animal. But entire communities lived because someone remembered to mend a boot. Someone stored food. Someone kept embers alive through the night. Someone taught a child not to walk onto thin ice. There is a tenderness hidden inside survival. And the archaeological record occasionally gives us another glimpse of this humanity. During the coldest phases of the Ice Age, people created art. They painted animals on cave walls. They engraved bone and stone. They carved figures. They made beads. They used pigments. They created musical instruments. This is extraordinary not because art requires comfort. It does not. But because it reveals that even in difficult times, humans were doing more than solving immediate physical problems. They were creating meaning. A cave painting does not provide warmth. A carved figure does not produce calories. A bead does not stop the wind. Yet people invested time and skill in such things. Why? We cannot know every meaning. Some images may have been connected to ritual, some to stories, some to identity, some to teaching, some perhaps to experiences we cannot reconstruct. But whatever their purpose, they tell us that human life had become deeply symbolic. People cared about how they represented animals. They cared about objects with no obvious practical function. They cared about sound, pattern, color, and form. They cared about belonging. This may be more connected to survival than it first appears. Shared symbols can strengthen group identity. Ritual can reinforce cooperation. Stories can transmit memory. Music can bring people together. Ornaments can signal affiliation. Meaning helps communities remain communities. A group under pressure does not survive only because its members possess enough calories. It also survives because people continue cooperating. They trust one another. They care for children. They maintain relationships. They remember who they are. In that sense, art may be part of resilience. A people who create together may also coordinate together. A people who tell stories together may preserve knowledge together. And there is something deeply human in the fact that even while glaciers dominated the north, someone sat beneath torchlight and painted the curve of an animal's back on stone. Outside was cold. Inside was imagination. Human beings were not merely asking how to survive tomorrow. They were also asking, in whatever prehistoric form the question took, who are we? What matters? What do we remember? What do these animals mean to us? What stories should our children inherit? The last glacial maximum, therefore, represents more than extreme climate. It reveals the maturity of the human survival system. Mobility, planning, clothing, shelter, fire, diverse diets, specialized tools, food processing, social networks, teaching, memory, symbolic culture. None was enough alone. Together, they allowed Homo sapiens to occupy landscapes no naked tropical primate could have endured. And the geography of the world itself created new possibilities. Because so much water was trapped in ice, sea level stood more than 100 meters below its present position. Shallow continental shelves became land. Between northeastern Asia and northwestern North America stretched Beringia. This was not simply a narrow bridge. At times, it formed a broad region of steppe and tundra, extending across what is now the Bering Strait. Humans and animals could live there. It was landscape, not merely passage. Farther west, the North Sea basin included vast lowlands now submerged. The region later called Doggerland connected Britain to continental Europe. Rivers crossed it. Wetlands formed there. Animals moved through it. People used it. In Southeast Asia, lower sea levels exposed great portions of the Sunda Shelf, connecting areas that are now separated by sea. Sundaland included broad plains between what are today the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and surrounding regions. The Ice Age map was profoundly different from ours, and no one living then knew that these lands were temporary. To them, a valley was a valley. A river was a river. A hunting ground was home. No one stood on Beringia thinking that future geographers would call it a land bridge. No family in Doggerland knew that one day fishing boats would pass above the places where their children slept. No hunter on the Sunda Shelf imagined that tropical seas would eventually cover his route. This is important because we often look backward with maps already finished. Prehistoric people did not. They lived inside landscapes whose futures were unknown. And near the end of the last glacial maximum, those landscapes began to change. The planet started warming, not smoothly, not everywhere at once, but the great ice sheets eventually began to retreat. At first, warming may have seemed like relief. Winters could become less severe. Plants could expand into new regions. Animals could move north. Land previously difficult to inhabit could open. Human populations followed. They expanded into territories once dominated by ice and cold steppe. But warming had another consequence. Ice became water, and that water returned to the oceans. Slowly at first, then in pulses and accelerations. The sea began moving inland. Generation after generation, familiar shorelines shifted. Rivers changed their lower courses. Wetlands expanded. Low plains became estuaries. Salt water entered places that had once been fresh. The very landscapes exposed by the Ice Age began to disappear. For thousands of years, humans had adapted to a world where ocean levels were low. Now the world began taking that land back. Imagine a family living near a broad coastal plain. Their grandparents remember hunting farther toward the horizon. Their parents remember camps that are now marshes. The children grow up watching tides enter places that were once dry. No single wave destroys the world. The change is slower than that. A little more water. A little less land. A river widening. A shoreline retreating. A familiar path becoming muddy. Then tidal. Then gone. The last glacial maximum had tested humanity with cold. The next great transformation would test something else: attachment. What happens when your homeland does not freeze? What happens when it disappears beneath the sea? Across Beringia, Doggerland, Sundaland, and countless unnamed coastal plains, human communities would face that question. Some would move inland. Some would follow rivers. Some would become more dependent on fishing. Some would build boats. Some would join other groups. Some would lose places where generations had lived. And as the Ice Age ended, one of the greatest migrations in human history was not simply people moving across the land. It was the coastline moving toward them. The old world was beginning to drown. There are disasters that arrive with noise: an eruption, a storm, a collapsing glacier, a wall of water. And then there are disasters that are almost silent. The sea rises a little, then a little more. A river slows near its mouth. Salt enters a marsh. A familiar island becomes smaller. A path used by grandparents disappears beneath shallow water. Nothing happens in a single dramatic moment. And yet, after enough generations, an entire world is gone. This was one of the great transformations at the end of the Ice Age. As global temperatures rose and the great ice sheets began to melt, water that had been locked on land returned to the oceans. Sea level climbed, not at a perfectly steady pace. There were periods of slower change and periods of more rapid rise. Across thousands of years, the total transformation was enormous. At the height of the last glacial period, global sea level had been more than 100 meters lower than today. That difference exposed vast areas of continental shelf. Places that are now seabed were once plains. Rivers crossed them. Animals grazed there. Forests grew there. People hunted, gathered, traveled, built camps, raised children, and buried memories there. Then the water came back. To understand what that meant, imagine living on a broad plain where the horizon seems permanent. There is a river to the east. Low woodland lies beyond it. To the west, wetlands stretch toward a distant coast. Your family knows where red deer pass in autumn. They know where fish gather in the shallows. They know which elevated ground remains dry after spring floods. Your mother was born here. So was her mother. The place feels ancient. Then, over the course of a lifetime, small changes begin. The marsh grows wider. Salt-tolerant plants appear where freshwater plants once grew. A low island disappears during high tides. The river mouth moves inland. Storms push seawater farther across the flats. An old campsite becomes too wet. The next generation builds farther uphill, then farther again. No one says that the world is ending, but the world is moving, and people must move with it. One of the most famous of these lost landscapes is Doggerland. Today, the North Sea separates Britain from continental Europe. But during much of the Ice Age, that sea was not there in its modern form. Large areas of what is now underwater were dry land. Britain was connected to the continent. Rivers crossed a broad lowland. Wetlands spread through shallow valleys. Grasslands and woodlands supported animals. Human communities moved across the region. This landscape has been given the modern name Doggerland. To the people who lived there, of course, it was simply home. They did not know they were occupying a temporary bridge between future nations. There was no Britain, no Netherlands, no Denmark, no North Sea in the form we know. There were rivers, marshes, coasts, hunting grounds, seasonal camps, perhaps places connected with stories, perhaps particular trees or ridges known across generations, perhaps routes children learned by following adults. Then the climate warmed. The great ice sheets retreated. The sea began advancing. Doggerland did not disappear in one night. For a long time it changed shape. Low areas flooded first. Freshwater systems became brackish. Rivers widened into estuaries. Wetlands expanded. Some parts of the landscape may initially have become richer. Estuaries can be productive environments. They support fish, shellfish, birds, plants, and mammals. A community capable of adapting could take advantage of such new resources. This is an important detail. Sea level rise was not simply a line of destruction moving across a map. It transformed ecosystems. A grassland could become wetland. A freshwater marsh could become tidal. A river valley could become an inlet. Resources disappeared in one place and appeared in another. Once again, the people most able to survive were those capable of changing what they ate, where they lived, and how they moved. A hunting camp that once depended heavily on terrestrial animals might become a fishing camp. People might gather shellfish where dry land had existed 2 generations earlier. Watercraft could become increasingly useful. Knowledge of tides could matter as much as knowledge of animal tracks. The human map was being rewritten. Eventually, however, adaptation could not preserve every place. As the ocean continued to rise, Doggerland fragmented. Higher areas became islands. Channels widened. Travel routes disappeared. Communities that had once moved easily across land faced growing stretches of water. Britain slowly became more separated from continental Europe. And perhaps the most poignant part of the story is that some people may have remembered the land before the sea took it. Imagine an older person sitting beside a coastal fire. Across the water, perhaps a low line of land is still visible. She tells children that when she was young, people walked there. The children look at the water. They have never crossed it on foot. To them, the story may sound strange. She describes trees, a river, a camp, perhaps a place where her father hunted. The children know none of these places. The landscape still exists inside memory, but no longer on land. This is how environmental loss enters culture, first as experience, then as memory, then perhaps as story. Doggerland was not unique. Far to the north and east, another enormous lost landscape existed between Asia and North America. Beringia. Today, the Bering Strait separates Siberia from Alaska. During periods of low sea level, the shallow seafloor between them was exposed. But Beringia was not merely a narrow bridge that people hurried across. At times, it was a vast region in its own right. Cold, dry, open, part of the Great Mammoth Steppe ecosystem. Animals lived there. People could live there too. For some human populations, Beringia may have been a homeland for generations. This changes the way we imagine migration into the Americas. It is tempting to picture a small group crossing quickly from one continent to another, as though moving over a temporary walkway. But prehistoric movement could be much slower. Families might spend years or generations within a region. People followed resources, not continental labels. They did not know when they had entered what future maps would call North America. The landscape simply continued. Then sea level rose. The lowlands flooded. Asia and North America became separated by water. Communities living within Beringia faced new choices. Move west. Move east. Follow changing coastlines. Use boats. Stay in shrinking territories as long as possible. Again, the sea did more than remove land. It rearranged human geography. A route that once connected populations became a barrier. Groups that had once been linked by walking distance could become separated by open water. This isolation could change patterns of marriage, exchange, language, and identity. The ocean was not merely altering maps. It was altering societies. Farther south, another immense drowned landscape transformed Southeast Asia. During low sea levels, much of the Sunda Shelf was exposed. The Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and nearby regions were connected across broad areas of land known today as Sunda Land. Rivers flowed across plains that are now beneath shallow seas. Forests occupied landscapes where boats now travel. Human populations could move across areas that later became islands. Then, as the Ice Age ended, the water rose. Lowlands disappeared. River systems were drowned. The once connected landscape fragmented. Higher ground became islands. Communities that had formerly shared land connections became increasingly separated by sea. But separation did not mean the end of movement. Human beings had already shown an extraordinary ability to cross water. Long before the Holocene, people had reached Australia and New Guinea, which required sea crossings even when Ice Age sea levels were low. This means humans possessed watercraft and maritime knowledge far earlier than many older models once assumed. We may never know exactly what the earliest boats looked like. Wood rarely survives across such time. They may have been simple rafts. Dugout forms could have appeared later or in different regions. Bundles of reeds, bamboo, logs, or other materials might have been used depending on local environments. The details are mostly lost. But the crossings happened. And once coastlines became more fragmented, maritime skill became even more valuable. The sea was both barrier and highway. A person who could not cross water saw an island. A person with a boat saw a route. This is another example of a recurring human pattern. Technology changes the meaning of geography. A cold plain is lethal without clothing. With clothing, it becomes habitable. A deep channel is a barrier without watercraft. With a boat, it becomes a path. A distant community is isolated without communication. With social relationships, it becomes part of a network. Humans survived environmental change partly because they repeatedly changed what the environment meant. As seas rose, fishing technologies became more important in many regions. Hooks, nets, spears, traps, fish weirs, boats, knowledge of tides, knowledge of currents, knowledge of seasonal fish movements, knowledge of shellfish beds. These are technologies and traditions that often leave incomplete archaeological traces. A stone point survives. A net does not. A wooden paddle disappears. A fish trap collapses. A woven basket decays. So ancient coastal people can look simpler to us than they actually were. The sea has also hidden many of their settlements. This creates a major problem for archaeology. Some of the most important places used by prehistoric humans are now underwater. The shorelines where people camped 16,000 years ago may lie kilometers offshore today. The evidence is not merely buried. It is submerged. Waves, sediments, currents, and later sea level changes may have destroyed or concealed it. In a sense, the end of the Ice Age erased part of the human archive. This means our picture of prehistoric adaptation is probably biased toward places that remained dry. Coastal cultures may have been more widespread and sophisticated than the surviving record easily shows. Imagine how much information is now resting beneath shallow seas. Fireplaces, stone flakes, animal bones, fishing sites, paths, burial places, perhaps wooden objects preserved in unusual sediments, places where children learned to swim, places where groups gathered every season, places no modern person has ever seen. Entire chapters of human experience lie underwater, and that raises one of the most haunting questions in prehistoric studies. What happened to the memory of those lost lands? We know that oral traditions can preserve information for surprisingly long periods under some conditions. Communities can remember eruptions, unusual floods, earthquakes, islands, and landscape changes through stories. But oral tradition is complicated. Stories evolve. Meanings change. Different events can be combined. Mythic language cannot always be treated as literal geological reporting. So we should be very careful about saying that ancient flood stories directly preserve memories of post-glacial sea level rise. There is no reason to claim that every flood myth comes from the end of the Ice Age. Cultures across the world have experienced floods in many settings. Rivers overflow, tsunamis strike, storm surges occur, coasts change. Still, the question remains fascinating. Could some traditions contain distant echoes of real shoreline change? Could a story about land swallowed by the sea preserve something once witnessed by ancestors? Could generations transmit the memory that a place now underwater had once been dry? Possibly. In certain cases, researchers have explored exactly this idea. But even when direct connections cannot be proven, we can say something more general. People notice the disappearance of home, and human beings tell stories about important losses. Imagine a community forced to abandon a coastal camp. They move uphill. Years later, elders point toward the sea and explain that their old home lies beyond the present shoreline. Another generation is born. The old camp is already underwater. The children never see it, but they hear the story. The story becomes part of identity. We came from there. Our ancestors lived where the water now stands. Perhaps later generations add details. Perhaps the place becomes sacred. Perhaps its loss becomes connected to moral lessons or supernatural forces. Memory changes form, but the emotional truth remains. A world was lost. Sea level rise also created pressure in places that did not flood directly. When coastal populations move inland, they encounter people already living there. More people may begin using the same valleys, rivers, and hunting grounds. This can lead to cooperation, marriage, trade, new technologies. It can also create tension and conflict. Migration is never only about movement through empty space. Most habitable land is already known to someone. When one population leaves a drowned coast, it may enter another population's world. This creates difficult negotiations. Can newcomers camp near the river? Can they hunt? Will the group share food? Will they merge? Will they fight? Will families form relationships? Will knowledge be exchanged? Environmental change becomes social change. And sometimes the result is innovation. A coastal group may know fishing techniques unfamiliar to inland people. An inland community may know plants, routes, and hunting grounds that newcomers do not. When groups combine, knowledge combines. One crisis can therefore create new cultural possibilities. This does not romanticize displacement. Losing a homeland is still loss. But human history repeatedly shows that movement can produce both hardship and creativity. Skills travel with people. Stories travel. Languages travel. Tools travel. Seeds of future traditions move inside migrating communities. As coastlines changed, human beings did what they had already done during African droughts, Ice Age winters, and abrupt climatic shifts. They adjusted scale. If the old camp failed, they moved. If hunting became unreliable, they fished. If water separated communities, they crossed water. If one social network broke, they formed another. The specific problem changed. The underlying response remained familiar. Flexibility. Now picture Doggerland one final time. The sea is closer than it was in the stories of the oldest people. A river once crossed open country here. Now tidal water moves through reeds. Trees stand dead where salt has entered the soil. A family packs its belongings. Stone tools. Hides. Food. Children. Perhaps a boat waits nearby. They do not know that the place they are leaving will eventually lie beneath the North Sea. They only know that staying has become harder. The decision is familiar. It is the same decision ancestors had made beside drying African lakes. The same decision others made when ice advanced. Stay or move. The family turns inland. Behind them, the water continues rising. Over generations, the old land disappears, but humanity does not. And then, just when the warming world appears to have established a new direction, the climate changes again. For thousands of years, temperatures had generally been rising after the coldest part of the Ice Age. Ice sheets were retreating. Forests were spreading into some regions. Habitats were reorganizing. People were adapting to a warmer world. Then, around 12,900 years ago, large parts of the northern hemisphere experienced a sudden return to colder conditions. It was not simply another ordinary winter. It was a climatic reversal lasting for more than 1,000 years. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas. For people living through it, the name would have meant nothing. What mattered was that the seasons changed. Plants became less predictable. Habitats shifted. In some places, food systems that had supported communities came under pressure. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, some human groups were already experimenting with a way of life that would eventually transform the planet. They were gathering wild cereals, storing food, living for longer periods in one place, managing landscapes more intensively. Then the cold returned, and humanity faced one of its most consequential questions yet. What do you do when mobility becomes harder, resources become less reliable, and you have already begun to depend on one place? One answer, developed slowly through countless ordinary decisions, would eventually become agriculture. Imagine that you are born into a world that seems to be growing warmer. The oldest people in your community remember harsher winters. They remember open landscapes where trees were rare. They remember animals that once moved through the region in greater numbers. But during your childhood, the seasons appear kinder. Woodlands expand. Spring comes with more certainty. Plants grow where cold grassland once dominated. The world seems to be changing in a favorable direction. Perhaps your family begins staying longer in one place. Perhaps there is less need to move great distances every season. Near the settlement, people gather wild cereals. They collect seeds. They grind them between stones. They store some food for later. Hunting remains important. So does gathering. But life is becoming slightly more settled. Then the cold returns, not for a week, not for one winter, for generation after generation. Around 12,900 years ago, the climate of the northern hemisphere entered a period known today as the Younger Dryas. The name comes from Dryas octopetala, a small Arctic and alpine flower whose pollen became more common in sediments associated with colder conditions in parts of Europe. To the people living through the event, of course, there was no name. There were only consequences: cooler conditions, changing rainfall, shifting vegetation, altered animal populations, uncertain harvests of wild foods, long memories of how things had been before. The Younger Dryas is one of the clearest examples of how quickly Earth's climate can change. Its exact causes are still studied and debated in detail, but one leading explanation involves major changes in North Atlantic Ocean circulation as large amounts of fresh water entered northern seas during deglaciation. The important point for our story is not the mechanism alone. It is the speed. The general warming trend after the Ice Age was interrupted. In parts of the northern hemisphere, conditions became substantially colder. Some regions also became drier. The ecological effects were uneven. The world did not freeze everywhere. Tropical regions did not suddenly become Arctic. But for human communities already adjusting to the end of the Ice Age, the reversal was significant. Imagine again a settlement in the Levant, the region along the eastern Mediterranean. This area includes parts of what are now Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and nearby lands. By the time of the Younger Dryas, some communities there had already developed ways of life very different from the highly mobile hunting groups of earlier periods. People associated with the Natufian cultural tradition, for example, had built substantial settlements in some areas before the Younger Dryas began. They hunted gazelle and other animals. They gathered plants. They used grinding stones. They collected wild cereals. They made tools for cutting and processing vegetation. Some groups remained in particular locations for extended periods. This was not farming in the fully developed later sense, but something important was changing. People were learning how much food could be extracted from a relatively small landscape. Living in one place has advantages. A shelter can be improved. Heavy tools do not need to be carried constantly. Food can be stored. Knowledge of nearby resources becomes extremely detailed. Children grow up knowing the same paths. Burial places may tie communities emotionally to the land. Relationships become centered around a home territory. But settlement creates vulnerability too. A highly mobile group can respond to scarcity by moving farther away. A more settled group has invested in place. Its shelters are there. Its storage facilities are there. Its familiar gathering grounds are there. Perhaps its dead are buried there. Leaving is no longer a simple decision. And when climate changes, that attachment matters. Suppose that wild cereals once grew abundantly near the settlement. In a good year, people could gather large amounts. They knew when the seeds matured. They knew where the densest stands grew. They used sickle-like tools with stone inserts. They carried bundles back to camp. They ground grain on stone. They stored part of it. Then the climate becomes cooler and drier. Plant communities change. Some stands become less reliable. Perhaps the best gathering places move. Perhaps yields vary more strongly from year to year. What should people do? They have several choices. They can move more often again. Some probably did. They can hunt more intensely. They can broaden their diet. They can fish where water resources allow. They can collect different plants. They can maintain old strategies while waiting for better conditions. or they can begin interfering more directly with the plants themselves. This last possibility becomes one of the most consequential developments in human history. Agriculture did not begin because one person suddenly had an idea called farming. There was no morning when a hunter looked at a seed and announced the invention of civilization. The transition was gradual, messy, regional, and spread across many generations. Imagine a woman gathering wild grain. She notices that some plants produce larger seeds. Perhaps she prefers cutting those. Perhaps some seeds fall near camp during processing. The following season, plants grow there. People notice. Maybe they deliberately scatter some seed on disturbed ground. Maybe they clear competing vegetation. Maybe they return to the same patch. Maybe they protect useful plants. Maybe they remove unwanted species. None of these actions alone is agriculture. But together, repeated across generations, they create a new relationship between humans and plants. Now imagine that climate becomes less predictable. Wild stands do not always appear where expected. A community that can influence where useful plants grow gains an advantage, not control. At first, certainly not. But influence. This distinction matters. Early cultivation may have been one strategy among many. People still hunted, still gathered wild foods, still moved, still depended on natural ecosystems. But the boundary between gathering and producing food began to blur. A wild field could be encouraged. Seed could be moved. Ground could be disturbed deliberately. Useful plants could be favored. Harvesting methods themselves could slowly influence plant evolution. Over many generations, humans began selecting certain traits without understanding genetics. Seeds that remained attached to the stalk were easier to harvest deliberately. Larger seeds could be preferred. Plants that matured at similar times could become more useful. When humans repeatedly collected and replanted certain individuals, the population of plants changed. Eventually, some domesticated cereals became biologically different from their wild ancestors. But this took time. Domestication was not a single event. It was a relationship becoming more intense, and the younger Dryas may have contributed to the pressures under which some communities increased cultivation. We must be careful here. It would be too simple to say that the younger Dryas caused agriculture. The origins of farming involved many factors: population patterns, local ecology, existing knowledge of plants, sedentism, social organization, storage, technology, climate. Different regions followed different paths. People domesticated plants and animals independently in several parts of the world at different times. There was no universal climate switch that turned hunters into farmers. Still, climatic instability mattered. When familiar resources became unreliable, experimentation became valuable. And once again, survival did not depend on one answer. This is perhaps the most important point in the chapter. Not everyone responded to the younger Dryas by cultivating plants. Some groups increased mobility. Some relied more heavily on hunting. Some shifted settlement locations. Some used aquatic resources. Some exploited coastlines. Some moved toward more favorable environments. Human survival remained plural. There was never one strategy called progress. There were many strategies, each shaped by local conditions. Imagine two communities living only a few hundred kilometers apart. One occupies a valley where wild cereals remain reasonably productive. The people stay near their settlement. They gather intensively. They store food. They experiment with cultivation. Another community lives in a region where those plants decline severely. Instead of trying to force the old system to continue, they become more mobile. They follow animals. They fish. They move seasonally between resource zones. Both may survive. Neither has discovered the one correct human future. They have simply chosen different solutions. This diversity is one of the great strengths of Homo sapiens. We do not need everyone to respond in the same way. Different communities can experiment independently. Some experiments fail. Some work locally. Some spread. A method developed in one environment may later move to another through contact. Humanity as a whole gains resilience because culture can explore many possibilities at once. During the younger Dryas, this experimentation took place within communities carrying knowledge from the warmer period before. The old people remembered one world. The young grew up in another. This must have created tension between memory and experience. An elder might say, "The plants used to grow farther north." A younger person might never have seen them there. Someone might remember a settlement that had once been productive. Another person might consider it useless. The past remained valuable, but it could no longer be followed blindly. The lesson from Chapter 3 returns. Memory must be combined with revision. Remember what worked. Observe what has changed. Then decide what still applies. And because human beings could communicate across generations, they could compare different climatic states. A community did not only know the present, it could carry an archive of previous environments inside its oldest members. That archive was imperfect, but it created perspective. This is one of the quiet powers of long human lifespans. A person who reaches old age may have witnessed unusual events that occur only once every few decades. Severe drought, unusual snowfall, a failed migration of animals, a sudden flood. When those events return, old memory becomes practical. The longer people live and the more respectfully knowledge is transmitted, the larger the climatic record available to the group. And then the younger Dryas ended. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures in the North Atlantic region rose rapidly. The cold interval gave way to the beginning of the Holocene, the geological epoch in which all recorded human history has unfolded. Again, the transition was not experienced identically everywhere, but the broader trend moved toward warmer conditions. Forests expanded in many regions. Ice sheets continued retreating. Sea levels kept rising. Ecosystems reorganized. And in several parts of the world, humans intensified relationships with plants and animals. In the Fertile Crescent, cultivation and domestication gradually developed into more established agricultural systems. People cultivated cereals such as wheat and barley. Over time, animals including sheep and goats became domesticated. Settlements grew. Storage became increasingly important. But something else had changed too. It was not simply that the Holocene was warmer. Earth had experienced warmth before. The crucial difference was that, compared with many dramatic fluctuations of the late Pleistocene, the Holocene offered a relatively more stable climatic background over long periods. Not perfectly stable. There were still droughts, floods, cold episodes, warm intervals, regional crises. The climate never stopped changing. But the extreme oscillations characteristic of parts of the last glacial period were reduced. For communities experimenting with agriculture, predictability matters. A farmer makes a strange agreement with the future. Seeds are placed in the ground today. Food is expected months later. Labor is invested before the reward exists. Fields are cleared. Plants are protected. Water may be managed. Harvest must be timed. Then food may need to be stored until the next season. This only works when environmental patterns are predictable enough to make waiting reasonable. A hunter can follow animals that move. A farmer asks the landscape to remain useful in one location. This creates new possibilities and new risks. If harvests succeed, a small area can support larger numbers of people. Food can be stored. Families can remain in permanent houses. Children can be raised close to fields and livestock. Population can grow. But dependence on crops can also create vulnerability. A drought can destroy harvests. Disease can spread through crowded settlements. Stored food can attract pests. Conflict can arise over land and water. Agriculture was not an escape from environmental risk. It was a new relationship with risk. Still, the stability of the early Holocene made this relationship increasingly possible. Human beings who had spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to unpredictable landscapes could now invest more heavily in place. A seasonal camp could become a village. A village could endure. Walls could be rebuilt. Storage pits could become larger. Fields could expand. Paths could become permanent. The dead could remain close to the living. Generations could grow up in the same location. And this was a profound psychological transformation. For most of human history, survival had depended heavily on the ability to leave. Now, in some places, success increasingly depended on staying. Staying long enough to plant. Staying long enough to harvest. Staying long enough to store. Staying long enough to build. The old technology of mobility did not disappear. Pastoralists would continue moving. Hunters and gatherers would thrive in many environments. Farmers themselves would migrate when necessary. But a new option had become powerful. Instead of moving people toward food, humans increasingly learned to move food production toward people. A plant could be encouraged near the house. An animal could be kept close. Water could eventually be redirected. The landscape itself could be modified more intensively. After hundreds of thousands of years adapting themselves to the environment, humans were beginning to reshape environments on a much larger scale. This did not mean the age of adaptation was over. Quite the opposite. Agriculture would demand new forms of adaptation. Living closely with many people, managing stored resources, coordinating labor, defending territory, resolving disputes, organizing harvests, caring for domesticated animals, managing inheritance, negotiating access to water and land. The climate crisis had not created civilization in one simple step, but the long journey through climatic instability had helped produce a species unusually capable of experimentation. That ability now turned toward settlement. Imagine one of the early villages near the beginning of the Holocene. Morning light enters through smoke. People emerge from houses. Some travel to gather wild plants. Some tend cultivated patches. Some hunt. Some prepare food. Children play near storage areas. Older people sit where they can watch the activity. The world is still dangerous. A bad season can still bring hunger. A storm can still destroy shelter. Disease can still kill. But something has changed. There is a growing expectation that this place will still be home next year, and perhaps the year after that. The future is becoming attached to a location. That simple expectation will eventually change everything. Because once people remain in one place, populations can grow. Once populations grow, social relationships become more complicated. Once food is stored, someone must decide how it is distributed. Once land is improved, people begin asking who has the right to use it. Once animals are kept, ownership matters. Once villages become larger, strangers live closer together. New problems appear, and human beings begin inventing new solutions. Rules, rituals, leadership, exchange, specialized work, systems of obligation, eventually towns, then cities. The world of recorded history begins far beyond the end of the younger Dryas. But the foundations are already visible, not because humans finally defeated climate. They did not. Not because nature became permanently gentle. It did not. But because, after surviving a world of extraordinary climatic instability, human communities entered a period in which longer-term planning in fixed places became more reliable. The survivors carried ancient skills with them: mobility, cooperation, memory, dietary flexibility, technology, social networks, imagination. Those skills did not disappear when farming began. They became the foundation upon which the next world was built. And in the final chapter of our journey, we will follow that transformation. From small communities facing cold and drought to villages surrounded by fields. From temporary camps to permanent homes. From survival through movement to survival through organization. And we will ask one final question. After all the ice, drought, ash, flooded coastlines, and sudden cold reversals, what was the greatest technology our ancestors carried into the Holocene? It was not stone. It was not fire. It was not even agriculture. It was the ability to imagine a different way to live before that way of life existed. Imagine a morning around 11,000 years ago. The sun rises over a small settlement. Smoke curls from several roofs. A child wakes to the sound of people already working. Someone is grinding grain against stone. Someone is repairing a basket. Someone else is checking animals kept near the edge of the settlement. Beyond the houses, patches of useful plants grow in places where people expect to find them. Paths have been worn into the earth. Storage pits hold food from an earlier season. The dead may be buried nearby. The living expect to remain. This is not a city. There are no kings, no armies, no written laws, no marketplaces filled with merchants, no monuments visible from miles away. But something enormous has changed. People are building lives around the assumption that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan for it. That assumption may sound ordinary to us. For much of human prehistory, it was not. Our ancestors had lived through a world of shifting rainfall, expanding deserts, advancing ice, retreating forests, volcanic disruption, rising seas, and sudden cold reversals. They had learned not to trust permanence. A lake could disappear. A coastline could move. A familiar herd could stop returning. A valley could become too cold. A plain could drown. And yet, at the beginning of the Holocene, in many regions, the climate entered a period of relative stability compared with the wild fluctuations of the late Ice Age. Not perfect stability. Never perfect. There were still droughts, floods, storms, regional cooling events, heat, crop failures. But the broader background became predictable enough, in many places, for people to make larger commitments to the future. They planted, they waited, they harvested, they stored, they built again on the same ground. And slowly, survival began to change its shape. For hundreds of thousands of years, one of the most important human skills had been knowing when to leave. Now another skill became increasingly important: knowing how to stay. Staying requires its own technology. A mobile group can reduce danger by moving away from a failing environment. A village cannot always do that easily. Its houses are fixed. Its fields are nearby. Its stored food is heavy. Its water source is local. Its social relationships are tied to place. Once a community invests heavily in one location, survival depends on making that location work. This creates new problems and new inventions. Imagine a village after a successful harvest. There is more grain than can be eaten immediately. That is good, but surplus creates questions. Where should it be stored? How should it be protected from rain? From rodents? From insects? Who controls it? Who receives food if one household has a bad season? What happens when someone steals? What happens when a family cannot work? What happens when another group arrives during famine? A stored harvest is not merely food. It is social power. It is responsibility. It is conflict waiting to happen. The larger the settlement becomes, the more complicated these questions grow. In a small band of 20 people, everyone may know everyone personally. In a village of several hundred, social memory becomes harder. There are more disputes, more relationships, more obligations, more opportunities for specialization. And so, human ingenuity, once directed mainly toward surviving climate and finding resources, increasingly turns toward the problem of living with many other humans. Rules become important. Customs become important. Ritual becomes important. Leadership may become more formal. Methods of sharing, exchanging, inheriting, and controlling resources become more structured. The same species that had once followed animals across open steppe now begins constructing social systems as carefully as it once constructed shelters. This is one of the hidden consequences of climatic stability. When the environment becomes somewhat more predictable, human society becomes more complicated. A person can become skilled in one task because someone else produces food. One individual may shape stone. Another may weave. Another may build. Another may specialize in ritual or exchange. Another may care for animals. Another may travel between settlements carrying goods and information. Specialization grows from interdependence, and interdependence is simply cooperation on a larger scale. This is where we can look back across the entire journey. Because none of the abilities that supported early villages appeared suddenly with agriculture. They had been forged much earlier. The Holocene world was built by survivors carrying ancient habits. The first of those habits was mobility. For much of prehistory, mobility was not wandering without purpose. It was intelligent movement. People moved because water shifted, because animals moved, because seasons changed, because familiar lands failed. Movement gave humanity something powerful. Escape. A species tied permanently to one narrow habitat is vulnerable when that habitat disappears. Humans learn to relocate across Africa, into Southwest Asia, across Eurasia, along coasts, across highlands, across islands, eventually into the Americas and the far reaches of the Pacific in later periods. Again and again, survival meant refusing to treat one place as the only possible world. Even when farming made settlement more common, mobility never disappeared. Farmers moved when land became exhausted. Pastoralists followed herds. Merchants crossed vast distances. Refugees left collapsing regions. Sailors carried people and ideas between shores. The ancient instinct remained. When the world no longer supports life in one place, humans can go somewhere else. The second great technology was cooperation. No individual human is particularly impressive when compared with many large animals. We have no claws, no natural armor, no extraordinary speed. A lone human facing winter without equipment is fragile. A lone human facing a large predator is vulnerable. A lone human with a broken leg may die. But humans rarely survived alone. A group can hunt collectively, watch children, share food, protect injured people, build shelters, maintain fires, carry knowledge, defend one another, spread risk. Cooperation converts weakness into resilience. It allows the group to become something greater than the sum of its members. This is one reason human survival cannot be reduced to the phrase survival of the fittest, if by fittest we imagine the strongest individual. Often, the individual who survives does so because someone else helped. A child lives because adults share food. An injured hunter lives because others carry meat back to camp. An elder lives because physical strength is not the only thing valued. And later, the elder's memory may save everyone. The third great technology was the social network. Cooperation within a small group is powerful. Connections between groups are even more powerful. A neighboring community may know where water remains. A distant relative may offer refuge. Another group may possess stone unavailable locally. Someone may know where animals moved. A marriage can connect territories. A gathering can spread information. An ornament can signal identity. Exchange can transfer not only objects, but ideas. The result is a network larger than any single camp. During climatic stress, this network becomes a safety system. If one place fails, information from another may offer an alternative. Human beings learned, very early, that survival could depend on people who did not sleep beside the same fire. The fourth technology was shared memory. This may be one of the most beautiful. A human life is short compared with climate cycles. No one can personally experience every kind of drought, flood, winter, migration, and ecological change. But communities can remember longer than individuals. An elder remembers the drought of childhood. A story preserves the location of water. A hunting tradition preserves the route of animals. A warning survives the person who first learned it. Language allows the dead to continue influencing the living. The lesson can travel across generations. This changes what inheritance means. Humans inherit genes, but we also inherit solutions. A child receives a world already interpreted by others. This plant is safe. That one is dangerous. Water lies beyond that hill. The ice is weak when it looks dark. The animals return after the first snow. Do not cross the river after heavy rain. Remember the path through the canyon. Culture is accumulated survival. The fifth great technology was dietary flexibility. Imagine how different human history might have been if our ancestors had depended on one food, one tree, one animal, one season. Climate change would have been devastating. Instead, humans learned to consume an astonishing variety of resources. Large animals, small animals, fish, birds, shellfish, seeds, nuts, fruits, roots, tubers, plants requiring processing, foods found in forests, grasslands, rivers, coasts, wetlands. Flexibility did not make famine impossible, but it reduced dependence. When one resource failed, another might remain. When large game moved away, smaller prey could matter. When inland conditions deteriorated, aquatic foods could matter. When wild plants became uncertain, cultivation could become more important. Survival rarely depended on one perfect food. It depended on knowing enough alternatives. The sixth technology was material technology itself. Fire, stone blades, bone points, needles, clothing, cordage, shelters, traps, boats, storage, grinding stones, containers. Each tool expanded the human body. Clothing gave us fur we had not evolved. Boats gave us a way across water. Needles allowed us to survive winter. Weapons extended the reach of the arm. Storage allowed food from one season to feed another. Fire created warmth where the climate offered none. Technology turned environments that should have been impossible into places where humans could live. But the seventh technology may have been the most important of all: imagination. Consider what imagination means in practical terms. It means seeing the world not only as it is, but as it could be. A dried lake says there is no future here. Imagination says perhaps there is water beyond the ridge. A cold wind says this body cannot survive winter. Imagination says perhaps animal skin can become clothing. A channel of water says the land ends here. Imagination says perhaps wood can float. A failing wild crop says food is disappearing. Imagination says perhaps seeds can be planted closer to home. A growing village says too many people are living together. Imagination says perhaps rules can organize them. Every great adaptation begins before it exists. It begins as a possibility inside a mind. This does not require one brilliant inventor. More often, innovation grows from hundreds of small adjustments. A slightly better knot, a warmer garment, a new route, a different food, a seed scattered intentionally, a shelter repaired in a better way, a boat shaped differently, a storage pit lined more carefully. One person experiments, another copies, a child improves the technique, a neighboring group carries the idea elsewhere. Over generations, small changes accumulate until the entire way of life has transformed. A mammoth cannot decide to become a fisher. A woolly rhinoceros cannot design clothing. A plant cannot choose to move itself toward a settlement. Humans can imagine a different relationship with the environment and then attempt to create it. This power is not unlimited. Many experiments fail. Many migrations end badly. Many societies collapse. Many people die during climate crises. Prehistoric survival was not a smooth triumph. It was full of loss. Some human populations disappeared entirely. Many cultures vanished. Languages were lost. Homes were abandoned. Coastlines swallowed places no one would ever return to. The fact that our species survived should not make us forget the individuals who did not. Survival at the level of a species can contain enormous suffering at the level of a family. Imagine a small settlement after a failed harvest. A parent dividing the last stored grain. Imagine people leaving a flooded coast with no certainty of welcome inland. Imagine a child during an Ice Age winter whose clothing cannot keep out the cold. Imagine a hunting group waiting for animals that never arrive. These people did not know that humanity as a whole would continue. They only knew the crisis in front of them. And this is why the story of human survival is so extraordinary. There was no master plan. No one could see the future. No prehistoric community knew that villages would someday become towns, that towns would become cities, that writing would appear, that ships would cross oceans, that humans would build civilizations on landscapes once covered by ice. They simply solved immediate problems. Find food. Keep warm. Protect the children. Remember the route. Share what you know. Move when necessary. Stay when possible. Try something different when the old method fails. And from millions of ordinary decisions, history emerged. The village grows. Perhaps there are now several hundred people. More children survive. Fields expand. Animals are kept nearby. Food is stored. People begin exchanging goods with other settlements. Paths between villages become more frequently traveled. Some routes become regional networks. Obsidian, shell, stone, pigments, and other materials move over increasing distances. Information moves with them. Soon, people are not merely adapting to nature. They are transforming landscapes. Forests are cleared. Plants are selected. Animals are bred. Water is redirected. Fields are maintained. Settlement becomes architecture. Memory becomes tradition. Tradition becomes institution. And eventually, in some regions, institutions become states. The long age of prehistory does not end in one morning, but the direction is visible. From survivors come farmers. From farmers come villages. From villages come towns. From towns come cities. And from cities comes the world of recorded history. Yet underneath everything built later lies an older inheritance. The instincts of the climate survivor. Look closely at modern humanity, and they are still visible. We store food. We build shelters. We trade across distance. We maintain networks. We teach children. We record disasters. We move when environments fail. We invent technologies to survive places our bodies could never tolerate unaided. We cooperate in groups far larger than the small bands of the Pleistocene. The tools have changed. The basic strategy has not. We survive by carrying knowledge forward. And so, as our journey comes to an end, return for a moment to the beginning. A lake in Africa. The shoreline is retreating. A small group stands near the water. They must decide whether to remain. There is no map, no guarantee, no destination marked safely on a horizon. Only memory, conversation, observation, hope. They leave. Thousands of years later, other humans sit beside fires beneath Ice Age winds. They sew clothing, repair tools, tell stories. They survive. Elsewhere, volcanic ash settles across a landscape. People adapt their diets, move toward water, search for alternatives. They survive. During the last glacial maximum, communities live beneath the shadow of immense ice sheets. They hunt, fish, gather, store food, create art. They survive. Then the ice melts. The sea rises. People watch ancient lands disappear. They move inland, build boats, follow new shorelines. They survive. The climate cools again during the younger Dryas. Food systems become uncertain. Some people move. Some hunt. Some fish. Some cultivate. They survive. Then the Holocene begins. The climate becomes more predictable. People plant, build, store, remain. And slowly, the survivors begin constructing a new world. When you lie quietly tonight, the world outside may feel stable. The roads remain where they were yesterday. Rivers still pass through familiar cities. Coastlines seem permanent. Summer gives way to autumn. Winter eventually becomes spring. The buildings around us create an illusion that the landscape itself has always been fixed. But our ancestors knew otherwise. They watched lakes disappear. They saw forests retreat. They saw ice advance from the north. They watched animals vanish from familiar valleys. They abandoned places their grandparents had known. They walked across plains now beneath the sea. They crossed mountains, deserts, frozen steppe, rivers, coasts, and stretches of open water. No one among them knew they were participating in the survival of Homo sapiens. There was no concept called human destiny. There was only the next morning, the next meal, the next child, the next storm, the next place where water might still be found. And somehow, through all those small decisions, humanity endured. Not because we were the strongest creature. We were not. Not because we were the fastest. We were not. Not because nature favored us with thick fur, claws, armor, or extraordinary physical power. It did not. We survived because when one strategy failed, we could try another. When one food disappeared, we could search for another. When one landscape became unlivable, we could move. When cold threatened us, we made clothing. When darkness threatened us, we carried fire. When water separated us, we built boats. When memory became too important to lose, we turned experience into stories. When one person knew something useful, language allowed the whole group to learn. And when the world changed, we could imagine ourselves changing with it. Perhaps this is the oldest lesson our species carries. The greatest human strength was never the ability to command nature. For most of our existence, we could not command it at all. The rain came or did not come. The glaciers advanced. The volcano erupted. The sea rose. Winter returned. Our ancestors had almost no power over these forces. Their power lay somewhere else, in adaptation, in cooperation, in memory, in curiosity, in the willingness to leave, in the courage to begin again. From those survivors came the first farmers. From the farmers came villages. From villages came cities. And eventually, from cities came the world surrounding you now. Every person alive today belongs to an unbroken line of survivors. A line extending through droughts, cold periods, migrations, eruptions, floods, hunger, and uncertainty. Your distant ancestors stood beside dying lakes. They crossed landscapes no longer visible. They endured winters beneath skies you will never see. They carried children over ground now buried by oceans. They passed knowledge from one voice to another long before anyone could write it down. They kept fires alive. They remembered. They changed. And because they did, the story continued. The story of the deadliest climate changes in prehistory is therefore not only a story about catastrophe, it is a story about flexibility, about how fragile bodies created powerful cultures, about how memory became protection, about how strangers became networks, about how tools became extensions of the human body, about how imagination allowed people to step into worlds for which evolution had never physically prepared them. And perhaps, most of all, it is a story about one quiet human ability: to look at a world that no longer works the way it once did and say, perhaps we can live differently. That thought may have appeared beside an African lake, beside an ice age fire, on a flooded coast, in a field of wild grain, We will never know the first person who thought it, but its descendants are everywhere. Every invention, every migration, every village, every city, every new way of living begins with the same possibility. The world has changed, and so can we. Long before there was written history, that was already the human story. And it is a story we are still writing. Sweet dreams. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of tonight's journey here on Calm History Nights. If this story helped you relax, learn something new, or drift a little closer to sleep, we would be grateful for your support. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who also enjoys quiet journeys into the past. Your support helps us continue creating long, peaceful history stories for nights when you simply want to slow down and listen. And if you are still awake, leave a comment and tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Until our next journey through history, rest well, sleep peacefully, and thank you for being part of Calm History Nights.